Fort Smith, Judged by 12, a Western by Chris Lowry. Chapter 1. He heard the bootsteps pound on the wooden floor before he saw the man and looked up from a box of his personal effects. A soldier in uniform, a private by the insignia on his arm, stood gasping for breath. "Mr. Parker," he barked. The man would make a good sergeant one day, Parker thought as he set a desktop journal into the orderly contents of the box. "You have found him." "Sir," the private saluted, though it wasn't required. Although he had been an officer in the war between the states, that commission was far behind him, a memory he sometimes shared over beer at the pub, or drinks with his colleagues in Congress. "Former colleagues," he amended. "What may I help you with, Private?" "Sir, the President asks for you to join him." Parker pushed the box to one side of the desk and hurried around the expanse of mahogany. "Lead on, man," he ordered, and then had to rush to keep up with the bustling private, though he would not stoop to run. The carriage ride through the streets of D.C. was quick. There were few people out this late in the night. That the guard knew he was still in his office did not surprise him. President Grant had patterned his network of spies after his hero, George Washington, and hidden eyes and ears were practically on every street corner. They passed the gate that led to the back entrance to the building. He could see lights burning in several windows, though no one was about. The carriage stopped at a door, and Parker didn't wait for it to be opened. Some men demanded those types of services from the servants, but the congressman did not. "Former congressman," he amended in his head as he stepped out onto the cobblestone walkway. He was going to have to get used to referring to himself as such, though another run wasn't out of the question. Perhaps seeking a governorship of Missouri or even in Arkansas. It would depend on his relationship with the president, of course, which he had little concern about until called to this nighttime meeting. Clandestine, he thought. A butler met him at the door, the man still dressed in finery. He had been expected. The man turned without a word and led him not to the Oval Office, where the president held larger meetings, but to a smaller room off the kitchen. He ushered Parker into the room where a meal of simple sandwiches was set on a desk in front of President Grant. "Took you long enough," Grant smiled and waved Parker over to a seat next to the table. "Mr. President." Grant slapped 2 sandwiches on a plate and passed it to Parker. "I don't eat at the state dinners," he explained as he tucked into a warm roast beef, ignoring the juice that dripped into his beard. He held a crystal decanter out and splashed 2 fingers worth of bourbon into 2 glasses and nudged one toward Parker. The 2 men ate in silence as the judge waited for the president to kick off the meeting. He had never been in the inner sanctum before, though rumors of it spread across the legislature like a wildfire on the prairie. It was a hallowed place where the real decisions were made, and Grant only brought his most trusted associates behind the door. Add to that a shared meal like 2 soldiers on campaign, and Parker was almost afraid of what would be asked of him. They finished the meat and bread, and Grant wiped his face with a fine linen napkin, removing most of the tracks of grease from his facial hair. He flipped open a box of cigars on top of the desk and offered one to Parker. They bit off the ends and spit them into the fire, then Grant lifted a branch and held the flame to his guest first. He lit his own stogie and tossed the branch back into the flame. "Have you heard of Fort Smith? In Arkansas? On the edge of the Indian Territories. I know it on reputation. That's all it seems to have these days." Grant cleared his throat and spat into the fire. He drew on the large cigar and let curls of blue smoke drift to the ceiling of the White House. "Did you do much rail busting in the war?" Parker nodded and swirled the drink in his glass, though he was reluctant to drink it in the presence of the president. It wouldn't do to lose his wits in such august company. "We ran upon some busted rails but did not do much of the action ourselves." Grant nodded. "We tore up a line or 2 in my day too. Bad business for the Rebs, but good business once the war was up and we put people to work rebuilding the railroad. My district saw some of that. I wish there had been more to spread around, but now that I'm in the canary seat," Grant indicated the desk in front of the fireplace, "I can see the limits in the budget." Parker maintained his silence. Grant was a dodgy old fox and would get to his point soon enough. There was no need for him to ask questions. "Those limits can be overcome," the president said after a moment of reflection. "Through partnerships with private industry." There it was. The talk of railroads, Fort Smith and Enterprise. The fox had something up his sleeve. "Fort Smith does not seem a place worth growing." He swirled his drink in the opposite direction and pretended to take a sip. "As it stands now, it is not," Grant agreed. "However, there are rumors swirling that expansion into that area can only serve to help our nation rebuild." "Indian Territory? A rail line that runs a southern route out to the Pacific Ocean?" Parker nodded. "Much like the transatlantic that was just completed. A network of commerce that crosses the nation," Grant beamed. "One not under control of the rail barons," Parker wanted to add. He had voted on a bill to limit their power and been on the losing side. Grant chose well in this selective conversation. "Commerce can help our country grow," he said in a careful voice. "It can indeed." Grant rose and paced around the desk, the cigar jutting in the air and puffing smoke like the rail engines he had just mentioned. "If a suitable launching point can be arranged, and a safe city built." "Fort Smith," Parker said. "Fort Smith." Grant stopped to lean against his desk, the military training still evident in his bearing. He stared down at Parker through the manicured bush of a beard that hid his jaw, dark eyes boring into him. "I'm offering you the judgeship of the Western District." "I accept," he said without hesitation. "Your job is to clean up Fort Smith and the territories." "You have sold me, Mr. President," Parker smiled. "No need to keep selling." Grant let a tight smile peek out of his beard. "They killed the last judge." "Killed him?" "In the outhouse. Shot him dead." "They haven't brought indoor plumbing to Fort Smith yet?" "You can bring them that along with justice. I'll pack an extra trunk." "One more thing," Grant said as Parker prepared to depart the Oval Office. "Mr. President? You're granted authority to deputize a Marshal service to help in your endeavors, but I'm assigning the first man to you." "Sir?" It was highly unusual. "His name is Eldridge Sample." The President watched Parker as he said the name, studying for a reaction. "I know him by reputation." Grant nodded, as if he expected this. "Much like you know of Fort Smith, Mr. Parker. Mr. Sample awaits you in the foyer." "He's here?" "I hired him for your protection, which began the moment you said yes." Parker gulped. "Sir. There are many men, Mr. Parker, many powerful men opposed to what we are about to embark upon. Those men may go at great lengths to have their way." Grant sat behind his desk and stretched his polished boots toward the glowing embers, basking in the warmth of the fire. He picked up a paper and dismissed the newly appointed judge with a casual wave of his hand. Parker nodded and departed the room. He stood for a moment outside of the door to compose himself. A judgeship, appointed by the President, and tasked with cleaning up a frontier town in a backwoods territory. No matter that it was only several hundred miles from where he called home, and had served for years, the land south of the Ozark Mountains had a reputation, and the edge of the Indian Territory carried the worst of those. Add to that the dangers that a potential bounty put upon him by powerful men in a railway conglomerate, for who else could the President have hinted at that would warrant a bodyguard, and Parker found he needed to hold to the molding on the door a moment. Luckily, the Secretary's chamber was empty. It had truly been him and the President alone for a conversation, and for some reason that bolstered his confidence. The most powerful man in the United States had trusted him enough to be alone with him, unguarded. On second thought, maybe he wasn't exactly alone. Grant had 2 soldiers stationed outside of his office windows, and there was a third, hidden in the shadow just outside the door to the hall. Pragmatic trustfulness. He pushed off the wall and marched past the guard, giving him a perfunctory nod that was returned. He made his way down the hall, admiring the painting of George Washington on the wall, a personal hero of the President. The edges of the canvas still held scorch marks from a march on Washington, but Parker could not recall which war it belonged in. His mind was too busy spinning at the sight of the man waiting for him in the doorway. Eldridge Sample, U.S. Marshal. Chapter 2. Eldridge Sample towered over the men around him at 6 foot 6 inches tall. He added 2 more inches with dingy cavalry boots, scuffed and battered, on his large feet. A worn 10-gallon hat perched on top of a distinct brow adding another few inches. His hands were long and slender, like the rest of his limbs, and at first, Parker had the impression that the man was a scarecrow come to life. All arms and elbows, legs and knock-knees. Until he moved. He had the grace of a dancer, light on his feet, and effortless. Parker had seen a man move like that once, a Russian visiting Washington for a ballet. There had been many women on the stage, and the audience fell into a hush at the sight of such a rarity of a male performer. Dancing at that. But the Russian twirled and leapt, seeming to defy gravity as he floated across the stage, and strong as he lifted one ballerina after another over his head again and again. Eldridge moved like that as he strode toward the judge, long leather duster whipping behind him like a flag. "Congratulations, Your Honor." He extended a massive hand that seemed too large to be natural. Huge knuckles popped out, a network of scars creating a map across the flesh. The judge shook it. Calloused palms, soft fingers. A working man's hands. Parker could see the instruments of his job strapped to his left leg and a second holster under his arm. "Marshal," Parker nodded. He came to Eldridge's shoulder, more solid and substantial after his term in the Senate, but not fat. Thick, he called himself. He did not go armed, though he had the right. After his time in the war, he did not want to carry a weapon. He was glad enough for the marshal to do it. Especially where they were going. "It's not official yet," Eldridge reminded him. "I'm just along for the ride for now." Parker knew that wasn't quite true. He had seen the men shadow his carriage once he left the White House and joined two others as he walked on the platform to meet the train. Eldridge flicked his eyes over the judge's shoulder, and Parker appreciated the assessment. The eyes never seemed to stay in one place too long. They roamed over the platform, the people on it, the train and surroundings, as if taking constant measurements. They landed back on the judge's eyes long enough to let him know the man was paying attention to him. To him and the world around them. He had noted the men that shadowed them. "First stop, St. Joe," Eldridge said. He stepped back to let the judge get into the rail car first and then climbed after him. They made their way to a private room in the middle of the third car and settled across from each other. The marshal reached into a saddlebag he carried as a valise and pulled out a tattered copy of Marcus Aurelius. "That's his weighty tome." Eldridge glanced at the cover, a sheepish look in his eyes. "Habit I picked up before the war," he said. Parker rooted in his valise and removed a new copy of Herodotus to show him. "Old habits die hard." The marshal held out his book and the two men tapped them together as if in a toast, then settled in to read as the train whistle blew and they rocked in their seats as the big engine fought for speed. Chapter 3. The door to their carriage opened with the squeak of a hinge. The judge glanced up from his book to see the marshal with a pistol in hand aiming at the door. The portly conductor stepped back, bounced off the frame, both hands up in surrender. "Tickets?" he almost begged. "Marshal," the judge chided. Eldridge slid the Colt back into the worn leather holster and reached into his pocket for 2 tickets. He passed them to the conductor who clipped the corners, licked his lips and passed them back before stepping out into the corridor. 3 men pushed past him and moved into the car. They stepped over the marshal's outstretched legs and flopped into the seats next to the window where they studiously ignored the other 2 occupants. "Tickets," the conductor announced with more authority this time. The man next to the judge passed him 3 pieces of paper, the edges were clipped and passed back, and he leaned away from the doorway. The look on his face did not seem happy, as if the order of his day was set awry and he was struggling to regain balance. It wasn't every day a man drew a gun on him. In the 10 years he had been a railway man, it had never been done. He avoided the war due to an abhorrence of violence that masqueraded as indignation at the brutality of conflict. Eldridge would have labeled him a coward, as he had served with many men during the war between the states who also hated combat. They provided doctoring and support structure to the combat troops in a rally to the cause, no matter which side they were on. Refusing to fight was an affront. Neither man shared their opinion with the other, for had they begun a debate, sides would have been quickly claimed and others might have joined in. The war was 10 years past, but the wounds and scars were still evident. The judge settled his book upon his lap and nudged Eldridge's boot with the toe of his own. "I am delighted to see you are prepared," he said. "But perhaps some restraint is in order." The marshal answered by reaching into his coat and removing a silver flask with initials that weren't his own etched on the side. He used the pad of his calloused thumb to spin off the top and took 2 deep swallows. The railway car filled with the intoxicating scent of whiskey. He didn't offer any to the judge nor to the men in the seats around them. He just sealed the flask and stuck it back into his coat. The judge noticed the man closest to him raise an eyebrow. "He pulled his gun on the conductor," he explained. "What are you carrying?" The man addressed the marshal. "Colt Navy." The man pulled a double-barreled Derringer from his own coat pocket and pointed it at the marshal's face. "Let's keep it in the holster," he instructed. Eldridge marked his place in his book and set it on the seat beside him. He studied the man pointing the gun at him, and his 2 other companions who had yet to produce a piece. "What's the meaning of this?" Parker demanded. "Just sit there and be quiet, Judge," the man next to him grunted. "We're going to meet some important people who want to have a word about your allegiance when we get to St. Joe." Parker glared at the man, but the black barrel of the Derringer swayed him to silence. Eldridge sighed. "I'm going to ask you boys to retire to another car so we can continue in peace." The men stared at each other with confounded looks before breaking into chuckles. "I like that you were polite and all, but you didn't say please. Please." The Derringer didn't waver. Eldridge moved. His speed was whip-fast as he slapped the Derringer away and toward one of the other men. The finger on the trigger tightened and blew a small hole into the chest of the man next to the marshal, filling the car with cordite and gun smoke. Eldridge grabbed the outstretched gun arm and leveraged the man out of his seat. He kept the movement going, spun him into and through the window. It shattered under his weight as he pitched out, the scream lost in the receding night. Eldridge kept moving, his giant frame reaching and shoving the other man through the window before he knew what had happened. That left the bleeding man in the seat, mewling and grasping at his punctured chest. The marshal lifted him up and tipped him out of the window as well. He sat back in his seat and picked up his book, ignoring the rush of the wind through the shattered window. Parker leapt to the window and stuck his head outside to what end he couldn't imagine. Men thrown from the train at such speed were not likely to survive. "You just killed those men." Parker stared out of the broken window at the landscape as it raced by them. "I plan to kill a hell of a lot more, Judge." Eldridge opened the door to their car and waved down the conductor. "We're going to need a new place to sit," he explained. "This window has broken." The rotund conductor pushed past him and studied the broken window, the clean floor with no shards of glass on it. He turned to stare at Eldridge. "What about those two men in here with you?" "What men?" Eldridge smiled. "I took their tickets," the conductor explained. "The men who joined you in Washington." Eldridge changed the pitch of his voice and stared at the conductor, eyes unblinking. "I believe you are mistaken." The conductor shivered. "They must have moved further up the train," he said. "Let me lead you to a different car until we can get this fixed." He led Eldridge and the judge down the tight corridor of the corridor and into an empty berth. He rushed away without checking to see if it would satisfy them. Eldridge settled on the hard cushioned seat and stretched his impossibly long legs to the bench across and covered his eyes with the brim of his hat. He rested bony large hands onto the butt of a pistol tucked under his arm. The judge wished he could be so relaxed. He had not killed in the war, and violence had never surrounded him before in his career. The assassins, for what else could they be called, had shook him to the core. He realized as he watched the steady rise and fall of the lawman's chest beside him that he was in real danger. Danger that could not only claim him, but claim his wife and their child. As Eldridge slept, Parker decided he would go to Fort Smith alone and leave his wife and on in the safety of St. Joe, at least for as long as it took to make a difference in the frontier town. He would make it safe for them, as he would for all families who wished to move there. Chapter 4. They rode to the top of a hill and looked down at the small town that ran several hundred yards along the mud-colored river. There was no order to the layout except for two main streets that ran like a cross, one beside the river, one that ran away from it and turned into a trail before disappearing into the Indian Territory. His wife had not made an easy go of it. She was a strong-willed woman and used to getting her way while her husband attended to affairs of the state and D.C. He was glad to bid her farewell after a cold loveless night together as she saw them off on another train in the morning. This one did not reach Fort Smith yet, though the line was being surveyed, and the crews moving at a pace of 5 miles per day over the rugged terrain as they worked south. The marshal and judge were obliged to move to horses for the remainder of their journey, which took one more day. There was the option to take a stagecoach, but the marshal balked at the suggestion when there were horses readily available. They were there. Fort Smith was a frontier town on the muddy Arkansas River, 400 yards from its namesake behind a palisade facing the Indian Territory. "Is this about what you expected?" The marshal took a draw from his flask. "I expected more," Parker groaned and shifted in his saddle. The miles had beaten his buttocks into a quivering soreness and he marveled at how far he had fallen off the horse, so to speak. When he was a younger man, either the soreness didn't matter or he was used to it. Used to it, he suspected. The marshal seemed to have no such trouble. That or his flask full of bourbon acted in a medicinal capacity that left little room for caring about how the saddle treated his posterior. Nor did it seem to affect his eyes. Company. Parker followed his hawk-eyed gaze to the bend in the river below. Indeed, a group of 4 horsemen galloped across the shallow waters of the sandbar, kicking up white splashes of foamy water that sparkled with miniature rainbows off the horses' legs and hooves. "I suspect they are here to welcome me," Parker mused. "They do not look to be the welcoming type, Judge." Parker looked closer as they topped a small rise and dipped out of view into a small vale that led up to the hilltop where the two of them waited. No, the men did not look welcoming, if judgment could be made by the bearing of their face. Hard scowls creased wrinkled brows, bushy eyebrows crinkled under battered hats. Of what he could see, the men did not look like a welcome party. They looked like men off to war, a face he was familiar with. They drew their nickering mounts 6 yards short of the two men on top of the hill and glared, hands resting on the butts of their pistols. No one had drawn yet, which made Parker wonder if they had been sent to intimidate or scare by the evil men who ran this town. One of the men to the left of the group leaned over the side of his horse by shifting in the saddle and shot a stream of brown spittle between his teeth to splatter on the earth. He was above average height, if things such as that could be judged proper about a man in the saddle. He had a young face, burned hard under the sun and miles on a trail, thin as they all were. As most men were who spent their lives working and living off the land. He wore a red shirt and brown breeches, but no coat even though the slight breeze must have been cold for the men on their wet clothes. "You him?" the spitting man queried. Parker shifted in the saddle again and wondered for a moment if he could dismount to stretch his legs. "It depends on who you mean by him," he said instead. "You that judge?" A statement instead of a question. Parker turned his head to glance at Eldridge and gawked. The marshal drew his pistol and shot them with no preamble. Parker barely had time to gasp before the cloud of gun smoke enveloped him, and drifted across the top of the hill, the echoes of the gunshots bouncing off the trees and stirring up the dogs to barking. The men lay about them in various stages of death, legs kicking as nerves died, the smell of piss and shit wafting up as muscles relaxed. Their horses neighed and whinnied and whipped around to race back to town. Eldridge glanced around to be sure there were no others lying in wait, then reloaded his pistol and slid it back into his holster. "You killed those men," said Parker. "Judge, if you're going to say that every time I shoot an outlaw, you're going to wear your voice out." "But that was a marshal." Parker indicated the silver star on one of the dead man's chest. Eldridge swung off his horse, bent down and unpinned the star. He polished it with the sleeve of his jacket and pinned it to the lapel. "You never got me one." "Duly commissioned," Parker shrugged. "I fear you haven't made our job easier." Eldridge nodded his head in the direction of a town. "I suspect I haven't." Chapter 5. There were 6 men in a huddle, bunched together like a herd, following the lead of a mustachioed man with dark hair and mean eyes. He had a tin star on his chest, the word sheriff etched in the center. He glared at the 2 men as they rode down the street and put his hand on his pistol. "You men are under arrest," he said in a voice too high for his body. Eldridge couldn't help but laugh, and that seemed to make the man angrier. He pawed for his gun and froze as the marshal whipped out his pistol and cocked back the hammer. "Marshal," the judge intoned. "I got 6 shots, Judge," the tall man shrugged. "Seems fitting there were 6 of them." One of the men at the rear took a few steps away from the group, both hands scrabbling for the blue sky. "I ain't with them. I ain't with them," he pleaded. "I just came to see what the shooting is about." "Stop right there," Eldridge barked in a voice that made even the judge stand still and hold his breath. No one on the street moved. It seemed even the dogs went quiet. Eldridge didn't want the men to spread out and catch them in a crossfire. He knew from experience that the best way to move things along was to take control. He stepped forward, shoved the barrel of his pistol up one of the sheriff's nostrils to push his head back until he whimpered and relieved the man of that gun that seemed to bother him so much on his hip. He glanced around at the others, watched them shrink under his gaze and pegged them for local business owners. None of them were armed, so perhaps they were just coming for a look. He stepped back, Colt still aimed at the sheriff. "I'll give you this back after we're done talking," he said and stuck the pistol into his gun belt. "Judge." Parker watched the enigmatic marshal for a moment. He had been with the man for less than 48 hours and already he had killed almost a dozen men, and saved his life twice. For all his reputation, Grant had indeed chosen the bodyguard well. "Sheriff," he said to the newly unarmed man. "I'm the judge." Chapter 6. The sheriff walked with a pace he would normally reserve for frog-hopping a prisoner to the small jail cell where they were kept. His pace was his own, but set by the 2 men following after him as he led them down Garrison Avenue. He wanted to be ahead of them, and feared falling behind them, for the long-barreled piece of iron resting in the giant marshal's hand had him worried. Samuel Lank Williams had been a man outside the law before landing in Fort Smith and the cushy job of keeping the town safe at the behest of the saloon owner. In his time as an outlaw, a highwayman and cattle rustler from Texas, he had seen fast men who claimed to know their guns. Men with names and reputations that preceded them. He had heard of Eldridge Sample as well. The man's exploits in the war, and in tracking down bushwhackers after bordered in the realm of fiction and myth. Yet he had seen the man move, and Lank feared the man's reputation did not exceed him. In fact, he reckoned it undersold the truth by a great measure. Lank had figured he was a fast man with the pistol, but the marshal moved with such fluid grace, it seemed as if the Colt was a mere extension of his already long fingers. And that made Lank nervous. Because if the man was faster than any other he had known, then what else had the stories played down would he discover? There was a mention of meanness. And stubbornness. His stature even exceeded the talk. Lank almost shrugged in the middle of a boardwalk that tracked along the rutted road and held still. He feared the marshal might mistake it for a signal of some sort and kill him out of turn. They passed the saloon where Shelley stepped out of the door to see them pass. He hooked large thumbs under his suspenders and kept them there as he watched in dark-eyed silence. His mustache trembled as if he longed to say words, or ask questions, but his full lips remained sealed. "Friendly," Parker muttered when he was sure they were out of earshot. "He's just measuring you, Judge." "Measuring you perhaps. I don't look as dangerous by half. By 3/4 maybe," Eldridge grinned. Rumor was you were a big shot back in the war." The judge snorted. He had been no big shot, just a small-town Missouri lawyer that signed up with the militia to protect his city from roving bands of bandits from the north and south. The border state bore the brunt and ravages from both sides. He had left the army a corporeal, disappointed he hadn't made lieutenant, but it seemed to have no impact on his career. After the war, he was sent to the Senate, and from there to a judgeship of the Western District by order of the president himself. Maybe the marshal was onto something, he smiled to himself. No big shot in the war, but a name to be considered nonetheless. He puffed up in pride, his chest sticking out a little further. "Here you go," said the sheriff. He stopped them in front of a simple square building that looked as if it were in need of repair or raising. "Here? This is the courthouse." Parker wasn't sure what he had expected. Certainly, no grand stone structure, but perhaps brick. Or more than one room. Eldridge laughed at the look on his face. "Frontier town, Judge." Parker sighed. There was God at work and he could see his hand. He had too much pride at the title, and hadn't even put in the work yet, but the Almighty made sure to remind him of his place. That thought and the laughter of the marshal brought a smile to his face. "It shall do." The sheriff wondered what they were laughing at. The building looked as if it was about to collapse, the porch canted to an uneven level and dipping almost to the street. He had shown it to them with a vindictive pettiness in his heart, yet here they were laughing like two madmen at what should have sent them back to their wagon. Parker looked at the building on this street. It was the main road, consisting of a jail, the courthouse, a general store, the saloon and a cafe for those who didn't want to eat in a brothel. A corral occupied one end of the street, two barns for tack and horses, and on the other end the fort sitting behind wooden barricades and log gates. He could glimpse houses scattered behind the street, a semblance of order working to be imposed. The land where the city would grow had been cleared of trees all the way to where the train would run, and the skeleton of a depot house was being built. There was work to be done in Fort Smith to be sure. This going to be a problem? The sheriff spit. Parker shook his head. The best way to handle a problem, Sheriff, is head on. Chapter 7. Eldridge opened the door to the jail and slipped inside. The top of his hat snagged on the rough lumber of the ceiling and he removed it with one hand. He kept the other on his belt above his pistol. The sheriff was tipped back on the two rear legs of a wooden chair, feet up on the edge of the desk, whisker-covered chin on his chest. "You always sleep this heavy?" The sheriff snorted but didn't budge. Eldridge took 2 steps across the floor and kicked the desk. It shoved Lank over backwards and he fell to the floor in a clatter of wood and grunts. Lank came up off the floor sputtering as he potted his pistol. He stopped as he recognized the marshal in his sleep-fogged eyes. "What the hell did you do that for?" "I couldn't find a rooster." Lank brushed the dirt off his pants and picked the chair. He placed it carefully behind the desk. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" Lank had been glad to be rid of the 2 men yesterday at the courthouse, leaving without being dismissed. He knew that he would see more of them, unless this judge sent his marshal over into the Indian territories like the last one was supposed to have done. Then it would just be Parker and Shelley would take care of him, as he had the last judge. Eldridge scanned the wall behind the sheriff and found a small notice board with a sheaf of wanted posters nailed to the side. "This all of them?" Lank glanced at where he pointed and jerked open a desk drawer. Eldridge ripped out his pistol and clicked the hammer. Lank froze. "It's just more paper," he explained. Eldridge let him stare at the gun a moment, then motioned him to move with a slight nod of his head. The sheriff fished a couple dozen more pieces out and placed them on the desktop. He nudged the drawer closed with his legs and kept his hands out in the open. "You haven't done much peacekeeping around here." Lank shrugged. "It's a frontier town." Eldridge picked up the pile of notices from the desk and ripped the rest from the board. "Not for long," he warned the sheriff. Lank watched him leave. His fingers itched to draw and shoot the marshal in the back. The only thing that stopped him was the fear Eldridge would hear and shoot him dead first. Chapter 8. Eldridge stamped along the boardwalk, eyes on the move as he studied his surroundings. He saw the shadow of a man standing in the open doorway of the saloon and stared at the figure with a questioning expression on his face. The shadow stepped forward into the light falling through the opening and Shelley, the proprietor, nodded. He was a stout man with black hair that curled around his head, and lines around his eyes that highlighted dark circles underneath. He had the look of a man who preferred the night, and environs of the saloon house, ill-suited to daytime hours, but curious. The saloon was a 2-story affair, a simple construction as were most of the buildings on the main thoroughfare, except for the new bank being constructed of brick. Dirt and rutted streets branched off in a grid pattern from Garrison Avenue, dotted with cabins and the beginnings of new homes. The marshal stopped and stared at Shelley for a moment. The man simply nodded again and backed into the darkness of the saloon. Eldridge could hear the clinking of glass and the whisk of a broom coming through the door as unseen people cleaned up from the night before. He kept going down the street until he reached the one-room building that served as the federal courthouse. He stepped into the cool interior and was surprised to find it empty. He was not surprised at the Spartan environment. The Marshal had been in several military courts held inside canvas tents, and so the addition of a wooden floor and 4 walls meant this courtroom was a veritable palace by comparison. Judge Parker sat in a plain wooden chair behind a plank table with splinters still on the top. A United States flag dangled limp on a pole behind the judge, and 4 chairs were set on the opposite side of the table. It was a far cry from the courtrooms in the East. Eldridge bit back a smile and laid the sheaf of wanted notices in front of Parker. "Where are the lawyers?" "There aren't any." "Is that legal?" asked Eldridge. "We don't need them for this part." Parker shuffled through the papers and passed a handful to Eldridge, who proceeded to study the pictures on the wanted posters. Every so often, he would grunt or make a committal noise as he leafed through the collection of outlaws, killers and scofflaws. "This is a wild bunch," he finally said, slipping 5 out of the stack before he passed it back to the judge. "Your first job is to go out into the territory and collect them." Eldridge shook his head. "Nope, my first job is to keep that sheriff from plugging you in the back. Then that saloon keeper after that. Anyone else? I've got a round of suspects. Someone killed that judge." Parker waved him off. "I think you made an effective demonstration at the depot when we arrived. Sometimes you got to repeat lessons like that to make them stick, Judge. I understand the position you think we're in, Marshal. I assure you that when you are successful in your mission, the men here in town will fall in line. I hope you don't fall in a grave before you can get them lined up. Then you should make haste. How are your hunting skills?" "I'm pretty good at catching rabbits." Eldridge showed a mouthful of large teeth. "Let us hope you are just as good at catching bad men. I'll head out in the morning." Parker fished a gold watch on a chain from his vest pocket on his chest and stared at the time. "There is still time today, Marshal." Eldridge glanced through the windows. "Guess you want to get at it?" Parker nodded. "The sooner the good people of this town see how serious we are in the discharge of our duty, the sooner the riffraff will get in line." Eldridge grunted. In his experience, the riffraff did not usually get in line of their own accord. But the judge was right. Sooner started, sooner done. He tipped his hat to the judge and opened the door, standing to one side in case someone was waiting out there to waylay him. When no shots rang through, he peeked first, then stepped into the light to get his horse and do his duty. Chapter 9. Ned Brimley liked to carve wood. Some folks around here called it whittling, but he knew that was not the proper name for it. Whittling was just making kindling, shaving off the ends of sticks into sharp points, adding sawdust to the street that helped dry out the mud, and spit and piss. Whittling was what old men did as they sat on wooden chairs by the boardwalk and passed the time until they died. Ned carved. When he was a boy, his family had traveled through Nashville on their way to Fort Smith, his father bound for the promise of land and glory out west. Ned had seen a statue in Nashville, carved from marble and looking like a real woman. She had been clothed in a sheet that his mother told him was called a toga, from the Greeks, which she then had to tell him was an island over by Italy. He barely listened, which was his habit as a young boy, a habit most young boys had. Ned instead was entranced by the figure of the statue. That a man had carved it from rock fascinated him. The smooth texture, the flowing lines, even tiny niches in the eyes to look like pupils. He was fascinated. At his heart Ned was an artist. The death of his father in Fort Smith from an illness left his mother a widow with 2 sons to feed. Ned and his younger brother. When his brother got sick and died, his mother signed him off to work at a stable and general store, then she ran off with a cattle trader. Ned never saw her again, and in his work as a stable boy, he had no time for artistry. But after a while, his heartache lessened, and he learned the routine of things around the barn, and even began to run errands for Mr. Tanner when he opened a general store. Ned watched the man arrive in and set up shop out of the back of his wagon. Within days he was building a wooden structure that would become his store, and Ned was paid to clean up after he was done at the barn. The 3 pennies weren't worth it, but the scrap wood Ned was able to keep made it worthwhile. He collected the pieces and at night would go through each of them, turning them this way and that in his hand, studying the wood for defects, and in time he could see figures in the wood. Horses. Soldiers. Faces. Animals. He took a penknife one night and carved a simple blue jay like the one he had seen that day sitting on a corral fence post. He kept his first crude figure on a shelf in Tanner's store, because that is how he thought of it still, even though he had bought it off the old man after saving all the payments he had been given over the years. He still carved at night, preferring to keep his hands busy, and he tried once to teach Will the art of it, But the details were lost on the boy, who preferred instead to whittle sharp points on the ends of sticks to create spears. When he saw Eldridge sample, Ned felt a tingle in his hands. That night, he carved a wooden Marshal star, and found a piece of driftwood in his pile that he pulled out to dry beside the fire. Ned was going to carve the Marshal. The wood was long, lean and knotted, textured after a long journey down the river. Ned liked to imagine that it had been in Colorado at some point, a tree knocked over by lightning since there were burn scars on one end. It tumbled and floated in its own twisting way down the river, rolling through bends, end over end. Past 1,000 other trees still standing until it washed up on the sandbar in front of Fort Smith, and Ned found it during a walk. He kept these thoughts to himself though, for he had learned long ago never to share a dream, or whisper things that were from other lives. No, these secrets he kept in his heart, and only sometimes allowed them out as his hands pulled the knife across the soft drywood and turned out pieces of sculpture fit to live in the halls of kings. He looked up from his books when the front door opened and Judge Parker stepped in. "Good morning," he called out. The judge returned his greeting. "I should welcome you to town." Ned moved from behind the counter to shake the judge's hand. "Ned Brimley, proprietor." "Isaac Parker, judge." "Well, sure you are. You know what they did to the old judge, right?" Parker nodded. "I'm here to see to supplies for the courthouse, and to set up lodgings for myself." Ned shuffled back behind the counter and pulled out a notepad and lead pencil. He licked the tip of the pencil and set it to page, then listed off the wood, nails, and tools the judge ordered to repair the courthouse. "Ain't you going to get a fella to do all that work for you? Do you have a carpenter around here worth his salt?" Parker wasn't sure. The state of many of the buildings in the city left him to wonder. "The undertaker's got the tools," Ned told him. "He's probably got the most experience too. Can you direct me to his home? I can do you one better. I'll get this order up and started and will." He screamed into the back of the store. A young boy of 16 ran out of the storeroom, dust covering his face and tip of his nose. "Sir? This here is Judge Parker, the new judge. Pleased to meet you, sir." Will used his manners. "They shot the last judge." Parker nodded with a tight smile. "So I am told. Take the judge over to the undertaker, and then deliver this." He passed the scribblings to the boy who folded it and stuck the paper in his pocket. The judge took his leave of Ned and followed the young boy to a house built several hundred yards back from the main strip. Even as he walked, the judge could see the intent to build on the land, even if nothing had been done yet. The preliminary clearing of trees, and a subtle layout of the trails in a grid pattern told him a surveyor had been through at some point. There was no mayor to ask now, and no city leaders to call upon. Most had been run out or killed. As far as he could tell, the town was controlled by the commander of the fort, the saloon owner and the now deceased corrupt Marshal with collusion from the sheriff. He wanted to speak to more people, and he would as he made preparations to begin his court and build his home, but that was the lay of it thus far. Will led him to a nice modest bungalow with several dozen open coffins leaning against the outside walls. "This is it, sir." "Thank you." "Will, was it?" The boy nodded. "Drop by the courthouse whenever you like." Parker dismissed the boy and watched him run toward the corral at the end of town. He turned to knock on the door, but it opened before he could touch the wood. A small miniature man stood in front of him, filling the doorway with the bulk of his shoulders. He was as wide as he was tall, thick arms, thick neck and heavy brow. "I saw you walk up," he said by way of greeting. The judge held out his hand. "Isaac Parker, judge." The man took his hand in a thick meaty paw with a grip like a steel trap. "Bartholomew Brown. Undertaker. I saw you ride in yesterday. They killed the last judge." Parker wondered if everyone in town was giving him a warning or if this was their way of greeting, by expressing what happened to the predecessor of the role. "I've heard. What can I do for you, Judge? I'm here to implore your services." Chapter 10. Eldridge saddled his mount and tied an oilskin blanket and kit to the back. He wasn't sure how long he would be gone on the other side of the river, and so stowed corn dodgers, salt pork and 2 bottles of Kentucky bourbon in the saddle bags. He imagined he could go a few days eating little, but the thought of skipping a drink on the ride gave him pause. He checked the cartridges for his pistol and for the Winchester repeating rifle in the scabbard by his leg. The weapons and munitions might be enough, but Eldridge knew he could always get more from the men he captured. If that particular well ran dry, he had a dozen pieces of silver rolled in a cloth and paper money he could use at a trading post to get what he needed. Since he packed so simply, he was on the path to the river in less than half an hour after leaving the judge. He wheeled his mount behind the buildings on Main Street and took a parallel path toward the river. He was sure men were watching him and his absence would be noted, but he didn't want to announce it by parading down the main avenue. He was worried about Parker and the threats against the judge. The easiest way would be to just clean house in Fort Smith. Kill all the outlaws and bad characters and start with a clean slate. But the judge was a man of law and Eldridge wasn't about to go to prison for a massive murder spree, even if it was in the name of good. He reached the edge of the river and saw a ferry boat on the other side. He raised a hand to wave it over and two men began hauling on the rope to drag it across. Calling the construction a boat was being generous. It was a raft, with water sloshing over the edge of the wood and soaking the feet of the ferrymen. A rope was tied to an ancient oak on one each side of the river and the current pulled the raft on a crescent moon-shaped direction as it crossed. Neither of the two men spoke as the marshal clicked his tongue to lead his horse onto the raft. Nor did they say a word when he paid a coin for the crossing. They just set to the rope, hauling in a rhythm that quickly carried them across the water. Eldridge glanced over his shoulder at the fort garrison constructed on the hill. He could see cannons aimed into the Indian territory, prepared for an attack, and soldiers on the wooden walls watching him as he crossed the river. He touched the brim of his hat, but none of the men returned the greeting. When he disembarked on the rutted road on the other side of the river, they had disappeared from the fort walls. He almost turned around. They were variables at play that he knew nothing about, that he and the judge needed more time to consider. But bringing in an outlaw would help cement the reputation and move them closer to the goal of civilizing the city. He held the reins for just a moment as he considered, then nudged his heels into his horse's ribs. They trotted until the fort was out of sight. Chapter 11. He rode for most of the morning without seeing anyone, though he spied several figures on the horizon and held that familiar sensation of being watched. Eldridge tried not to let it bother him. The Indian territories weren't bad, not like some of the stories coming out of the plains. Still, bad men hid out over here, and a lone rider could make an interesting target. He had that same thought as he watched a dot on the edge of the landscape turn into a blurry shape. That same shape grew greater in detail as he rode closer toward it. Another rider headed his way, riding a horse at almost the same pace. He was a good 100 yards away when he saw it was a man on the back of a horseback. They stopped 5 yards apart and sized each other up. "Howdy," said Eldridge. "Hello," the tall Choctaw answered back. He wore a black suit with a vest and a bowler hat as he sat bareback on an Appaloosa pony. The blanket under his legs was hand-woven with a beautiful pattern, and the reins to his horse looked new, a mix of fabric and skin and bridle bits. "Are you a marshal?" the man on the horseback asked. Eldridge nodded. "I'm over here hunting up outlaws." "That is a good and necessary thing," the Indian said, his stoic face betraying no emotion. "Wish it wasn't," said Eldridge. "But I fear you are right in that. Are you searching by name, by reputation or by legal act? Do you know any by name or reputation or a legal act?" The man nodded. "I am familiar with all three." Eldridge sat up in his saddle, pretending to stretch. It allowed him to place his hand on the edge of his holster, a move that did not go unnoticed. "But a passing familiar," the Choctaw said. "I have done work for a lawyer out of St. Louis representing the interests of my people." "That so?" Eldridge squinted at him. "We cannot beat you in battle," said the man. "Perhaps your courts of law will serve us better." Eldridge snorted. "You do not believe this to be so?" the Choctaw asked. "Friend, I'm a servant of the court, but I do not find all they do to be in keeping with the best interest of anybody." The stoic face nodded with a sage and solemn sigh of his own. "Justice can be a fickle mistress. There has never been a truer statement," said Eldridge. "You have the authority to operate here?" Eldridge used his other hand to slip open his coat and reveal the silver star affixed to the belt. "Federal authority to apprehend and return to trial in Fort Smith under Judge Parker." "The new judge?" Eldridge nodded. "They shot the old one," the Choctaw advised. "We're bringing civilization to that town." The man nodded. "It was brought to us as well. I do not think the act was as charitable as most imagined." "I'll be over in these parts a lot," Eldridge advised. "Perhaps you could spread some friendly word." "Perhaps I could. And if you encounter a man by name, reputation or illegal act, you could send word my way." "Perhaps I could," the Choctaw repeated. Eldridge reined his horse to one side to let the man on the Appaloosa pass. He gave the marshal a nod and trotted by a few steps, then drew up on the reins. "Marshal," he said. Eldridge had watched him go by and was staring at his back as the man turned. "There could be one of the men you are looking for in a meadow 3 miles from here. I do not know him by name or any of the other methods you describe, but he had a look about him." "A look?" "Unwashed, unkempt. He could just be hunting," Eldridge said. But he did not think it was so. An Indian wouldn't mention a hunter, or settler moving through to reach points west. Or drovers or cowboys or any other number of people moving through the territory. "He is hunting," the Choctaw answered. "But it is not game he seeks. "That kind of look," Eldridge said. "The worst kind. You will find him if you turn left at the stream." With that, the Indian turned his mount and cantered away. The Marshal watched him until he disappeared, then gave his mount a nudge back onto the path. He had a man to see 3 miles away. Chapter 12. The Choctaw had been right. Eldridge followed the simple directions, to the stream, and slipped off the back of his horse. He walked it through the trees, one hand on the muzzle to lead it by the bridle and keep the horse quiet if they saw the outlaw's mount. Eldridge had memorized the faces of the men on the wanted pages, for it would not do to try and make comparisons by holding the page up to a face during a confrontation. An innocent man might take offense at the action, and an outlaw might take it as an invitation to commence shooting first. He saw a face he knew on a man pissing in the stream as it meandered across the clearing. Eldridge stepped out of the trees and moved across the grass with a stealth that belied his giant stature. He made it to within a dozen feet of the man before he finished his business and turned around as he buttoned his fly. The man jumped with a start. "Jimson Green," Eldridge announced. "What say you, you red-headed peckerwood?" Jimson glanced down at the silver star on Eldridge's belt and grimaced. "I say go for your piece and let the better man win, Marshal." 2 hands moved faster than the eye could see, blurring to the holsters at their sides. 2 hands drew, the whisking sound of iron on leather sliding across the clearing on the gentle breeze. 2 reports rang out, miniature explosions that filled the wind with smoke and powder. But they were not simultaneous. One rang out a half-second before the other. A blink of an eye really. But it was all that was needed. The only amount of time necessary for the slug to twirl down the end of the barrel and break the sound barrier. To travel the distance across the grass meadow and slam into the heart of the outlaw. The impact knocked his aim off by a fraction of a millimeter. The distance was enough to change the trajectory of the bullet he sent toward the Marshal, just enough to whiz past his ear with the sound of an angry wasp. It tugged on the stray hairs that dangled from under his hat and flipped them almost gently on his collar. Then the outlaw glanced down at the hole in his chest in pain and surprise. His eyes went wide at the ruptured heart, the muscle no longer moving, no longer pumping blood, the life-giving liquid frozen in his veins. He dropped to his knees, as if to beg the Almighty for forgiveness, as if to ask the Marshal for a final charitable act. His mouth gaped like a fish out of water, no sound coming out. He pitched forward, forehead planting into the grass with a crunch. Then the smoke was gone and the buzzing whir of insects returned, filling the meadow until there was only the Marshal and the noise and the scratching of a dead man's boot twitching on the ground. "Damn it," Eldridge sighed. He looked around to see if anyone was sneaking up on him, if the outlaw was serving as a distraction. They did not often ride alone. But he was the only man standing as far as he could see. He sighed again and slipped the Colt back into his holster. He marched back into the woods to retrieve his horse, then made chucking noises with his tongue against his lips to gather the one belonging to Jimson. He led the horses over to the dead body and grunted as he slung it across the back of the outlaw's mount. He tied the wrists to the boots, so the corpse wouldn't slide off, and cinched it tight under the belly of the horse. Eldridge took the fallen pistol, checked the chambers to count the cartridges. 4 unmarked casings glinted in the afternoon sun. He shoved it in his belt in easy reach of his hand and tied the lead rein from Jimson's horse to a saddle horn. He popped over the back and settled in the saddle, arranging his coat and checking the surroundings once more. Then he pointed toward Fort Smith to the north and clicked his spurs gently against his horse and set off at a steady walk. Chapter 13. Eldridge stepped into the packed saloon that night. Smoke and noise filled the air, a piano player pounded keys in the corner. He had dropped off the dead outlaw with the undertaker and endured a little jawing from the judge, who remarked on his propensity to kill. The Marshal felt a drink was deserved and so visited the only saloon in town. The floorboards shook under stomping boots as men yelled and screamed. The Marshal elbowed his way through the chaos and pushed against the bar. He caught the eye of the mustachioed bartender and waved him over. "What's your name, friend?" "I ain't your friend," the man spit on the floor. "Then give me the good whiskey, you bastard." Eldridge smiled to show he was kidding. "Name's Charlie, not bastard." He reached under the bar and set a clear bottle full of amber liquid on top next to a dirty glass. "All we got." Eldridge grabbed the bottle and traded it for a silver coin that Charlie dropped in a jar under the bar. The Marshal turned and set his back against the edge, bottle in one hand, glass in the other, and watched the room. His eyes roamed over the saloon girls sitting at the tables. There were 6 that he could see, and a particular straw-haired one that captured his attention. She had a loud laugh, smooth skin and an air about her that he admired in an instant as she sat beside a cowpoke and made him feel like a king in the world. Eldridge sauntered across the room and towered over the table. The cowpoke glanced up and sneered. "Keep moving." "Hello." Eldridge smiled at the woman and ignored the man. Her sharp eyes glistened in surprise and curiosity at the tall man who ignored the cowpoke beside her. "Hello yourself. Eldridge Sample," the marshal held out his hand to her. She shook it. "I know who you are," she said. "We've heard about you." The cowpoke licked his lips. "Marshal," he stammered. "If I could just finish up here, I ain't got no business with you." Eldridge slipped his coat open, flashing a sliver badge that glinted in the lamplight. He pulled out a couple of pieces of worn paper. "That's funny," said Eldridge. "'Cause I have a couple of John Doe warrants right here that says you do." "I ain't done nothing," the cowpoke scooted back in his seat. "You sure?" "Yes sir." "I don't know," Eldridge said. "The guilty often have a look about them." "You have that look." "Does he not?" The woman perched on the seat next to him, smiled, and closed her mouth, as if she wished to hold back a giggle. But she said nothing. Eldridge noted a change in the noise level around him. People grew quiet, their voices softer as they peered in curious wonder at the scene playing out in front of them. "Marshal," the cowpoke whined. "I swear, I ain't done nothing to deserve no warrant. We just got in here tonight off the trail." Eldridge took a step forward. The man flinched back to the other side of the couch with a small cry that sounded loud in the saloon grown still. The marshal shifted his knee against the man's leg and twisted around so that he was seated between the man and the sandy-haired prostitute. "I just came in off the trail myself," he said and held up the bottle. "Perhaps you would join me in a drink?" He poured whiskey into the glass and held it out to the woman. She took it from his hand, still smiling. The cowpoke held out his own glass, but it trembled in his fingers. Eldridge reached out and clasped the man's hand in his own, his long fingers enveloping the fist as he grasped it and held it still. He poured 2 fingers into the glass. "You seem nervous," the giant man looked down at the cowpoke. "You might do with some fresh air." The cowpoke's hand kept shaking as he nodded and sipped from the glass. It was a wonder no drop was spilled down the front of his stained shirt as the man drained the contents. "Fresh air," he stammered and pushed off the couch. Eldridge and the woman watched the man stumble across the room. Noise followed in his wake as people realized no one was getting shot at that moment and returned to their merrymaking. "Poor man," said the woman. "That wasn't a nice thing to do, Marshal." Eldridge reached up and took her by the hand again. He pulled her closer so he didn't have to raise his voice in the din. "I am a particular sort of man," he told her. "I have not often been accused of being nice. I have heard." "Tell me what you have heard." He leaned in so she could whisper in his ear. "Marshal," Shelley stalked in front of the couch and stopped short. "Are you going to run off all my business?" Eldridge glanced around at the drinking crowd. Even the cowpoke had perched against the bar where he was trading coin for rotgut. "It doesn't seem like I've run much off," said Eldridge. He shifted his body away from the woman, but his right hand was trapped behind her neck, pinned against the sofa back with the weight of her. Shelley grinned a malicious sneer as he slipped both sides of his coat open. He wore a red velvet vest and 2 ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist. His hands held the coat open to show the expanse of fabric across his stomach, conveniently pausing above the handles of his guns. "If she's not working, I'm losing money," Shelley growled. Eldridge moved his left hand to the slit pocket in his coat and pulled out a gold coin. One long finger flicked it off the edge of his thumb so that the coin flipped end over end straight at the saloon owner's nose. Shelley caught it before it bounced off his face and flinched. Eldridge held his pistol in his left hand, aimed in the general direction of the man, if not directly at him. "You got your money," Eldridge said. "Whiskey and woman." Shelley grumbled. He stared at the coin in one hand, the gun aimed at him and sighed. "Enjoy your evening, Marshal." He turned and left. Eldridge watched him go, and slid the tip of his gun back into the holster. "That's going to cause me trouble," said the woman. "What's your name?" "Ruth," she answered. "Ruth." Eldridge pulled her close with the right hand trapped behind her. "I think if anyone tries to give you a bit of trouble, you just let me know." Chapter 14. The marshal rode across the river and through the Oklahoma Territory. He stopped at a shack that served as a trading post and general store. It was manned by a pock-marked-faced man with bony wrists and an overlarge Adam's apple on his wheat-stalk neck. His head bobbled as he spoke to Eldridge, wild eyes glancing over his shoulder at the Indian woman hidden in the shadows. He pointed the marshal down the road, to a town half a day's ride further on. It wasn't so much a town as a collection of shacks around the trail. There wasn't even a sign on the outskirts warning visitors where they were. Just a couple of gray board buildings, one masquerading as a saloon connected to a store, the other an office of some sort, for dealing with Indians or cattle. Eldridge tied his horse to the hitching post out front and stood to one side of the open door to prepare himself. Even from here he could smell the stench inside. Unwashed bodies, stale hand-rolled cigarettes made of skunkweed, warm beer, and vomit. It rolled through the door like a fog and reached for his nose like the tendrils of a live thing. There were men in there who had spent hard time on the trail, the odor of dust and cattle, dung fire and something else. The coppery scent of dried blood. It was something he was too familiar with, an old ghost that haunted him. The men inside had killed and hadn't bothered to wash after. Or maybe they were paying for a bath later. He could see an old woman bent over a fire, heating water in a washtub. Eldridge stepped inside and moved so his back was to the wall, not the door. The noise stopped when he stepped in the room, but he couldn't see the man watching him as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, orange oil lamps flickering shadows that competed with the firelight from the hearth. The room had 2 tables set in front of a plank-wooded bar on 2 barrels. 4 men lined the bar focused on the drinks in front of them, 2 more sat at the table in the back. 4 men sat at one of the tables, cards spread on the top in front of them, interspersed among dirty bottles of whiskey. The game itself wasn't an oddity. Eldridge had seen plenty of men playing at cards before. It was the players themselves that gave him pause. One was an Indian dressed in deerskins who looked like a drover. Another was a black man, tall and well-built with rounded shoulders and a stoic face. The other 2 were white men, one with sparse whiskers that aspired to be a beard and a blue shirt, and the other with narrow features and tiny black eyes. That was the man the Marshal was after. "Let's go ahead and step outside." "I ain't going nowhere with you," he scooted back from the table. "Marshal," said the black man. "I don't want to shoot your men. There's 9 of us and you ain't got but 1 gun," the other white man grunted. Eldridge ripped the revolver from his belt and bashed it across the narrow-faced man's temple. He reversed the backswing and slammed it across the blue-shirted man's head. They both plopped onto the spit-stained plank floor. The bartender swiped a double-barreled shotgun from under the plankwood bar. Eldridge flipped the flap on his coat and yanked a second pistol from a shoulder holster. "Hold steady." He cocked the hammers on both pieces, the first aimed at the players, the second at the barkeep. The men still standing did as he advised. Chapter 15. Eldridge led the 2 men to the horses tied up outside of the small store bar in the middle of the Indian Territory. "Which ones belong to you?" The man in the blue shirt glared at the Marshal. A bump the size of a goose egg turned his brow into a misshapen lump, which turned his glare more comical than menacing. The second man, his partner, looked like he had half his face painted with red. The blood leaked from a gash in his hairline. It dripped onto his collar. Neither spoke, but the bloody man pointed to a gray horse and a black pony. Eldridge motioned them to mount up. He tied their hands to the saddle horns with one hand, the other holding the pistol at their chest. It took but a moment, then he mounted up and began to lead the men back to Fort Smith. They reached the road and he saw the balance of the men from inside the bar spill out onto the porch to watch their departure. "Your friends are going to give me trouble," he told the 2 men who didn't answer him. Eldridge debated for a moment. He could shoot them from this distance and probably hit 3 or 4 before they scattered behind cover. But he did not have warrants for those men, nor cause to shoot, except as a preventative measure. "That won't hold up in court," he said to the men. Again, they remained mute. Eldridge saw the black man move away from the others and mount up on a red mare. He galloped off in the opposite direction until the Marshal lost sight of him. The rest remained on the stoop in front of the bar, milling about, but taking no action. Eldridge took that as a good sign and led the 2 men over the crest of the hill until they disappeared. They rode for an hour without incident until Eldridge heard the first wasp whiz past his ear. It was followed seconds later by the explosive repercussion of gunfire, but by the time that he had heard the report, he was already off his horse, rifle drawn and ready to aim. He searched the surroundings for the puff of smoke from the gun that would betray the position of the sniper. He could see nothing. Whoever they were, and he suspected it was that gang of dirty ruffians from the gritty saloon or the black fella that rode off. He wondered just how in the hell they got in front of him. He slid off the side of his horse and yanked the 2 prisoners down as well. They fell in dusty plops, groaning and complaining at the rough treatment. Their words fell on deaf ears as Eldridge pulled his repeating rifle from the holster and slapped his horse on the rump to move it out of the line of fire. He took a knee and shouldered the rifle as bullets whizzed and whined past him. Puffs of dust erupted around as their aim drew true, but he had their measure. The ambush was not well planned, nor were the men good shots. They were concentrating their fire from a single position on a small rise with long grass. Eldridge took aim at a dark shadow in the grass and sent a bullet through the forehead of one of the assailants. He heard the cries of dismay from the other men. Then they fired faster, anger fueling their trigger fingers. "Die, you son of a bitch!" one screamed and raised up on his knees for better aim. Eldridge rewarded him with a round through the chest. He pitched over and slid down the hill, a slick swash of blood darkening the light green grass. He swung the rifle to the right and got one more, before the concentration of bullets was too much. They couldn't aim, but so many balls of lead were flying that it was just a matter of time before he was hit, and the dust eruptions in the dirt around him drew close. Eldridge threw himself to one side, rolling toward what he hoped was a depression in the earth that would provide some measure of protection from the men shooting at him. The two prisoners were screaming and crying, but he could not tell if it was encouragement to their fellow outlaws or at the Marshal himself, begging for protection from the hail of bullets. He watched as the puffs of dirt chased his position, drawing closer, and cursed the ambush, cursed the cowardly men who wouldn't meet him face to face. Another sound echoed across the trail. A second rifle booming with the steady percussion of a man working rounds through the chamber as fast as his hand could move. Each boom rolled across the Marshal's position, and stopped the bullets from the men shooting at him. He counted 6 before the guns went silent and he was left with the wailing of one of the prisoners. Eldridge glanced around. The whining buzz of flying lead was gone, as was the dirt puffs on the ground. He stared at his two prisoners as he crawled up. Both of them had been hit. One gone to meet his maker and the other well on his way if the spreading pool of crimson liquid darkening the earth was any sign. "I'm got shot, Marshal," the man moaned. "Them sons of bitches got shot me." "Then you should have told him to stop shooting," said Eldridge. He kept his rifle at the ready for whomever was the other shooter, the one who rescued him. Just because the man had saved him, didn't mean he was friend. He saw a figure stand on the small rise where the ambushers lay in wait. It raised a rifle overhead and waved it back and forth, a signal for peace and approach. Sample waved him down. Halfway down, he saw it was the black fella. "Thank you, friend," Eldridge called out, fingers still wrapped against the trigger. Rufus held the rifle in his left hand, right hand loose and wide from his hip to show peaceful intent. "I figured from the talk back there, they were planning you some harm," Rufus grinned. "Thank you for your help." "Yep." The wounded prisoner gave one last cry for his mother and expired, eyes open as he stared at the heavens. "Well, you did take your time, didn't you? Wanted to see how you handled yourself. Against a dozen?" "There was only 8. Eldridge checked his horse and seeing it was not injured, mounted up. He grabbed the dead prisoner and tied him to the back of the other horse, and repeated it with his friend. He wrapped the loose reins of the 2 horses with the now dead prisoners on them around the saddle horn. "And you see how I did?" "I saw." Chapter 16. Parker heard the rough rhythm of bootsteps on the fresh-cut boards outside of the courthouse and glanced up from the desk he kept near the bench in the back of the room. There was a pistol on the desktop next to a new book of law fresh in from New York he had been meaning to read, and he laid a hand upon the grip, barrel aimed at the door. Not that he expected trouble, but more along the lines of being careful of who might decide to pop through. There had been warning enough of how the last judge met his end, and he did not seek to follow that same path. 2 men filled the open doorway, more black shadow outlines with a change in light from outside to in. It took a moment for Parker to recognize Eldridge still in his dust-stained, travel-creased outfit, and the black man standing next to him was dressed in the same manner. His dark skin was creased with wrinkles from worry, a shaggy mustache drooping over full lips over a wide nose. Dark eyes sparkled with intensity as he nodded to Parker. "You gonna shoot me, Judge?" Eldridge barked in a voice that matched his height. "I wasn't sure who was making such noise coming to see me," Parker smiled back. "I see you have a man in custody, but I don't recognize his likeness." "He ain't my prisoner," said Sample. "He's my rescuer." "Is that a fact? Saved my skin out there in the wild lands." The Marshal put a hand on Rufus' shoulder and pushed him forward. Parker raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I did not take you for a man in need of saving, Marshal?" "Surprised the hell out of me too." Sample perched in one of the chairs and stretched out his long legs that seemed to take up half the room. "A couple of them boys you sent me to get had companions that decided they were going to save the hell out of 'em. This gentleman in front of you dissuaded them of that notion." Parker nodded and studied the man. "What's your name?" "Rufus." "Just the one name?" "Bass, sir." "Rufus Bass?" "He's my first deputy," said Eldridge as he watched them both. "We're not prepared for deputies," said Parker. "You need me to go pull the star off that worthless lank?" Eldridge didn't stir, but Parker figured the tall man would do just that. "How do we know he's not an outlaw?" "What of it?" Eldridge asked. "We haven't spoken much of my past, but I suspect you have heard rumors of my time in the war." He didn't wait for answers. "These men we are going after, Judge, they ain't the law-abiding citizens you grew used to in D.C. These are low-life curs, and it takes a certain kind of man to hunt them down." Rufus stood in silence as he watched the 2 men confer. "You know how to hunt these men?" Parker turned to him. Been tracking with the Cherokee for a few years, Rufus answered. Married to a squaw, Eldridge added. Hell, he's practically the chief's son. And he saved my life. Parker thought of several more arguments he could offer, but the conviction he heard in Eldridge's voice convinced him he would lose any that he offered. Instead, he shifted the law book to the side to reveal the worn leather cover of a Bible. Chapter 17. Judge. Sir. Sir? I like that. Not too many men in this town call me sir unless they're on my payroll. I afford a man the respect he deserves, so long as he earns it. What about you, Marshal? Are you going to call me sir too? Eldridge flipped open his coat flap. Shelley saw the butt of the Colt in his shoulder holster and flinched as the Marshal reached for it in one smooth motion. His fingers paused at an inside breast pocket and pulled out a square brown bottle of Tennessee whiskey. He smiled at Shelley, a grin full of malice and contempt, and sniffed the air as if he couldn't be bothered with the man. He poured a half-glass full of tea-colored liquid into a crystal tumbler and returned the bottle to his coat. Unless you make me call you worse, he said, and swirled the glass before taking a sip. Shelley suppressed a shiver. The Marshal was going to be trouble, that much he could tell. Too soon to know if he needed to kill the man though. He turned to the judge for a solution to the more immediate problem. Judge, he said. I'm here to get one of my men turned loose. Which one? Clamp it. He's been working with me for years. Parker leafed through the warrants and pulled out a crumpled parchment with an image of the man drawn on it above the word murder. He killed 2 men. Justified, Judge. He had a trial under the last judge and was found guilty. Hence the warrant for his arrest. Shelley leaned one elbow on the table and leaned in to whisper. That judge and I had an understanding of one another. I'm hoping you and I can come to an agreement of mind as well. Parker snorted. Bribery? Shelley backed up. That's against the law, Judge. I'm just a businessman in this town trying to give you the lay of the land. I'll make my own map, thank you. Judge, warned Shelley. There aren't many places in this town. I know you're planning on working with the railroad people to bring in some changes around here. I just want you to know that not much changes without my say-so. He watched Eldridge lean back in his chair and put a hand on his gun. That sounds like a threat, Judge. I believe you're right, Eldridge. Shelley shook it off. Not a threat. He held open his coat. I am unarmed. Eldridge stood up and towered over the man. His hat nearly touched the top of the ceiling in the courthouse. Well, I ain't. Shelley backed toward the door. I'm just telling you the way it is. The way it was, Parker called after him. The age of corruption in this town is over. I'm ushering in an age of enlightenment. Eldridge stomped after Shelley as the man fumbled through the door and out into the street. The Marshal kicked the door shut with his boot. You should have let me shoot him. What would that have accomplished? You wouldn't have to watch your back for one thing. Eldridge, do you know how many threats a judge gets each day? Men are sentenced to death and hurl curses at you as they are dragged off. Families of men sent to prison cry for vengeance. If I were to listen to every pompous business owner who came into my court and swore they were the men in charge, I couldn't do my duty. Our duty. Eldridge reached into the drawer of a desk against the wall, pulled out a brown bottle of Kentucky bourbon. He sloshed the contents into a small glass, slammed the whiskey and refilled the glass. I'm just trying to make it easier, honest Judge. And if we went around killing everyone who disagreed with us? I'm not saying he can't disagree, said the Marshal. But our duty would be a damn sight easier if we could get rid of everyone in the way. That's why I think you're the man for this job. You think just like the men you're going to hunt down for this court. Eldridge nodded. It was not a part of himself that he liked, but it was a part that had served him well in the past. Maybe it would continue to serve him well in this endeavor. Shall we begin? Parker asked as he tried to keep his face neutral, eyes dancing across the third shot Eldridge poured. The Marshal sipped this one slow and set the glass on the faded wood of the desk. Chapter 18. Shelley leaned against the bar and tapped the wood with one giant knuckle. Charlie the bartender rushed over with a shot glass and a bottle of clear liquid. He sloshed a shot into the glass and started to carry the bottle back with him. Leave it, Shelley said as he tossed back the shot and refilled the glass. Go get Lank. Yes sir, Billy nodded and rushed through the saloon doors. Shelley glanced around as he held up the glass. Daytime wasn't the best time for saloon keeping, but there were a few crusty-looking travelers drinking at a table, crinkled playing cards on the surface between them. A couple of his hookers hung on the edge of the table, waiting for their chance at the winnings. It was mostly quiet, which he hated. He wasn't making any money when it was quiet. But the silence made it easier to hear the hurried steps of Lank and Billy as they pounded up the plank boardwalk and through the doors. Charlie, Shelley motioned the bartender closer. He put a thick hand on his shoulder. Find someone to help get Clampett out of that jail. Charlie held out his hand to Lank. I don't carry it with me, stupid. Don't call me stupid, Sheriff, Charlie warned. Just tell him where the damn key is then, and let him get on with it. That judge is gonna hang my man while the two of you debate which is the dumbest of the dumber. Desk drawer, Lank said and watched while Shelley poured a third shot and quaffed it. Can I have one of those? Shelley pointed toward the door. The barkeep just left the building, he answered. He motioned Lank to follow him into his office behind the bar. I just met with Parker and that son of a bitch, Sample, he said as he said. You should have let me kill him. Which one? The Marshal, Lank sniffed. That there is one wily bastard, Shelley said. He would have seen you coming a mile away. A rifle would do the trick. Yeah, it would. Or it would bring down more trouble than it's worth yet. I'll have that judge in my pocket before the week is out. I don't know, Shelley. This one don't seem like the last one. Lank, they're all like the last one. If you say so. Go on, get out of here. Let me think on this. Shelley opened the door to his office and searched the saloon. He spied Lizzie, a young dark-haired worker, and motioned her over from the poker table. Why don't you and Lizzie spend a little time together, Sheriff? On me. Lank brushed his hand on his pants and smoothed his mustache with one sleeve. Thank you, Shelley. You are welcome. You just keep me in the loop. Lizzie offered her arm to Lank and escorted him up the rickety stairs. Shelley shut the door to his office and went to the smoke-stained window pane. He stared through the smudged glass at the edge of the jail he could see further up the street. The last man in that building had been his man and the one in the tiny courthouse had been his as well. These new men would belong to him soon enough. That or they would be dead. Chapter 19. Eldridge held out an empty tin cup and let the gray-haired woman pour thick liquid to the rim. You the new Marshal? He showed her the silver star pinned to his vest. You ain't doing such a good job your first night out. Eldridge chewed the egg slowly and washed it down with black coffee. I guess I'm going to need you to explain that to me. There was a jailbreak last night. He glanced through the window to the jailhouse several buildings up. The front door was closed and everything looked tight. Did they go out the back? He pushed away from the table. She refilled the tin mug and stuck it in his hand. Bring this back when you're done with it, she told him. Eldridge balanced the coffee as he hopped off the boardwalk and rushed across the street. His long legs carried him to the door of the jail in seconds, and he paused a moment to switch the cup to his other hand and pull his pistol. Then he took another second to fumble with the latch, but couldn't manage it with both hands full. He slid the pistol back into his holster, unlatched the door, and pulled the gun again. He pushed the door open with the barrel. Nothing stirred inside. He eased the door open the rest of the way with the tip of his boot, and stepped through. He could hear men snoring, scratching, the general noise from a crowded cell, and wondered if the cafe owner had been mistaken. Eldridge stepped back to the wall that separated the two cells from the office. One was empty. Both of Shelley's men were gone. He checked the door for the second cell and it was still locked. The rattling woke one of the prisoners. You bring us coffee, Marshal? What happened to those two men? Don't you know? If I knew I wouldn't be asking about it, would I? Somebody came and got them. I can see that. Who is it? Why should we tell you? A second man woke up. Because if I were in your position, I would be angry that they didn't open the door to my cell too. That shut them up. He listened as they grumbled among themselves and muttered, but they offered no more information. Suit yourself, said the Marshal. He would find out about the men. Things had a way of working out, clues would pop up. It wasn't always easy to read people, but most of the time they let something slip. He could have gotten more from the prisoners, exchanged their information for a prison sentence. It might have cut down on how much time it would take for him to find the others. Might even lead him to the men who set them free. It didn't matter. He would find them all anyway. Back in the war, that had been his job. Some people called him an assassin. He supposed that label fit as well as any other. He was just good at hunting people. Good at picking up on clues and signs, and lucky as all hell in a gunfight. Always had been. Too bad that luck didn't extend to telling the judge though. He enjoyed his lukewarm coffee and checked the lock on the door before returning the mug to the cafe on his way to the courthouse. Chapter 20. He shuffled through the door and down the boardwalk toward the saloon. He wasn't the first man to note the arrival of the stage, and a small crowd of men had gathered. Ned wasn't above using his bad leg as an excuse to get closer as he excused himself and pushed through to the front. Some of the cowpokes snarled, but he ducked his head and smiled and kept moving. The townsmen didn't seem to mind since this was a regular occurrence. Ned leaned against a wooden pole holding up a roof over the boardwalk and took some of the weight off his leg while he waited. The stagecoach driver jumped off the top seat and opened the door to the coach. The men watched as a white leg slid out of the dim interior to rest on the simple metal step attached to the side of the carriage. It was just a glimpse of soft smooth skin that was covered by a simple dress as the rest of her stepped out of the coach and into the sunlight. This one was a tall redhead, couldn't have been more than 19. Rail thin, but Shelley would go to work on that soon enough. She was followed by 3 brunettes, none of the quartet classic beauties, but in the dusty streets of the frontier town, they would be popular nonetheless. Not quite the streets, thought Ned as he watched Shelley push through the swinging doors on his bar. "Welcome," he called out and opened his thick hands to wave them forward. "I bet you're tired after your trip." He herded them up the steps and into the saloon. "Charlie's going to make you lunch, and then we'll talk about your contracts." The redhead looked over her shoulder, eyes full of fear, and saw Ned. She gave a tiny little smile, just a hint of a grin to him, and he felt his heartbeat flutter. Then she was through the doors, leaving Ned to stare after the space where she had been as the men around him went back to their business. "She smiled at me," he repeated to himself. Ned held no delusions about his place in the world, though there was some pride in how far he had come. He had moved from stable boy to store assistant and then store owner when Tanner died, and now he was a part of a growing community. Maybe even a city leader someday. A lot of folks looked on him as a cripple on account of that horse kicking his leg when he was a teen, and he let them think that way. People didn't need to know everything about you. But he longed for a woman, and not just the embrace of one of Shelley's saloon girls. Ned wanted a wife. He thought the redhead would do. He screwed up his courage and limped into the saloon. Shelley had lined up the women beside one wall and appraised them. The tall one was too thin, the shortest had a mole that might cost him a few dollars a week, but all in all not a bad investment, he thought. "Charlie, feed them," he ordered as he turned for his office. He saw Ned standing just inside the doorway and crinkled up his thick brow. "We don't see you in here too much, Ned." Ned looked around the inside of the saloon. "Fact is, Shelley, this is only my second time inside." "That a fact? Then that is a cause for celebration. Are you going to buy me a drink?" Ned worked the apron through his finger as he took 3 bold steps forward. "I wondered if I could talk to you. I think you're doing a fine job of it." "I meant in your office?" He cleared his throat. "Business. You want to discuss business with me?" "Ned, I don't need to order anything. Not that kind of business." The saloon owner stared at Ned for a moment, the line between his eyebrows growing deeper. But he had to admit, his curiosity was piqued. He motioned the store owner to follow him and stepped into a small room off the saloon. Ned had never been in Shelley's inner sanctum before. The walls were plain and unadorned except for 2 items. An oil painting of a nude lady reclining on a couch that made Ned's ears turn scarlet, and a drawing of a building that looked like an opera house. Shelley leaned back in a leather chair behind his large desk and waited for Ned to speak. He didn't offer him a seat or a drink, not at least until he found out how much it was going to cost him. "I want your help." "My help? It's something I think you're an expert in. You planning to open up a saloon in your store, Ned?" "That's the only expertise I possess that I can imagine you wanting." Ned shook his head. He stuttered. "Spit it out, Ned." "I want a woman." Shelley boomed laughter across the narrow confines of the office. He reached into a side drawer on his desk and pulled out 2 tumblers and whiskey. He poured 2 fingers for Ned, 2 more for himself, and passed the glass to the nervous store owner. "Ned, I got 6 you can choose from, only $1 an hour." The store owner took a sip of whiskey and grimaced past the burn. "I want you to help me buy a wife." Shelley considered him for a moment as he put his tumbler to his lips. "You want me to buy you a wife?" Ned nodded and mustered up his courage again. "I heard you can pay for a woman to come out here, like you do, and they will be your wife. Some of the pokes were talking about it in my store." It was Shelley's turn to nod. "Yeah, that's true. You saw who came in today. I'm helping them start a new life out here. That's what I want. I want you to help me find a wife to start a new life." "You planning on leaving us, Ned?" "I ain't leaving." "You want me to find you a wife?" Ned twisted the edge of the dust apron in his hands, picking at the frayed edges. "Please." Shelley watched him glance over his shoulder through the open door and glance back down in a hurry. The scarlet from his ears had spread to his cheeks and was working its way down his neck. "You like one of the girls I brought in today, Ned?" The store owner nodded. Shelley moved from behind his desk and threw one arm around Ned, and steered him toward the door. "Which one?" "The tall one." "That was fast, Ned. Have you been thinking about this?" Ned shrugged. Shelley nudged him back toward his desk and sat him in the chair. The saloon owner perched on the edge and stared down at the man. "I like you, Ned, so let's work out a deal. I brought her out here at great expense, and if I sell her contract to you, I'm going to be out even more money. The money she would earn from me while she's your wife. Do you understand that?" "I've got business sense, Shelley." "Good, then let's not beat around the bush. I'll let you buy her contract for what I paid her, but I'm going to need some extra to cover my losses." He could see Ned's finger working on the apron, this time tracing numbers. After a moment, he stared at Shelley. 3 weeks. 3 weeks what? That's what I figure for you losing out and getting a new girl out here to replace her. 4, said Shelley. I want a cushion for unforeseen obstacles. Ned held out his hand. I'll send Will over with the contract money and get you the rest by the end of the week. Shelley pumped his hand up and down and pulled him up from the chair. He steered him toward the door. As soon as the boy gets here with the payment, I'll send her back with him. He pushed Ned out of his office and waved to catch Charlie's attention. Charlie, send the redhead in to talk with me a minute. Chapter 21. Rufus dropped an armload of wood next to the tiny campfire and laid against his saddle on a blanket spread on the ground. He watched Eldridge stir a pot of beans over the coals, and reached around to root in his saddlebag for a chunk of jerky. Break this off in there, he said and passed it to him. Eldridge pulled a knife from his boots and shaved small strips of the dried meat into the beans. Better than salt, he commented. They finished the preparations in silence and ate in silence. Rufus took the pot and plates down to a small creek they camped next to and rinsed them off before Eldridge packed them away. The Marshal pulled a bottle from his vest pocket and took a sip. He offered it to Rufus, but the tracker waved him off. We need clues, said the Marshal. He nursed the brown bottle. Flames flickered through the glass, throwing prisms across his face. I know where to go. That would be the type of information you want to share. You ain't going to like it. I don't have to like it if it's going to help. Eldridge studied the passive brown face of his companion. Well, I'm going to think on it a little bit, Rufus finally said, still watching the flames. It was bad form to stare into the fire, and he knew it, but he also felt as if he had a sixth sense when it came to being outdoors. He could feel when animals were about, when people were watching, and he felt no such thing in the little hollow they sheltered in for the night. The flames messed with his ability to see in the dark, but even if he didn't feel safe, at least he didn't feel danger was about. Eldridge must have agreed with him because the Marshal took one more long pull on the bottle, tucked it away and crossed his hands on his chest. He closed his eyes, and was soon snoozing, his breathing coming in low and steady. Rufus took his eyes off the fire and gazed up at the stars. That was sometimes his favorite thing to do when out in the territories. The night sky was awash with color, the twinkling and blinking of so many stars that in some places it looked a solid mass. He wondered about them sometimes, wondered what they were and what they meant. He had read somewhere that each star was like the sun, only with other planets around them. He didn't think that was true though, since all these stars were white and anyone who could see knew the sun was yellow. If they were like the sun, wouldn't they be yellow too? He wondered if they did have people on them or around them, what kind of people would they be? Then he remembered that God the Great Spirit made all of man, and he felt a little guilty about thinking that he made other people in other places. But then what was the harm in that? He made white people in Europe and black people in Africa and red people here, and yellow people in China. He had seen brown people in Mexico, and brown people in Texas, and all sorts of all colors all over and in between. And all of them thinking on different gods and spirits and such. It would have given him a headache to list them all out in his head, so he just figured that if the Great Spirit could make all those people on Earth, he could damn well do what he pleased at any place there was in the stars, white, blue, yellow or any other color. That seemed to settle his mind, though it was a thought he had before, and if he had to guess, he would do so again. The vastness of the sky tended to make him feel small, and the quiet of the night made his brain work harder. That was okay because he liked to read, and liked to think. Eldridge snorted and shifted on his bedroll. He liked this Marshal too, the long tall man from somewhere east. He could be a crotchety bastard when he took a mind to, and Rufus had heard of him by reputation before he showed up in Fort Smith. But Eldridge treated him with respect, and not a fake kind. Real man-to-man respect, and Rufus had not gotten that from many white men before. Maybe when they camped out again, he would talk with the Marshal on the stars and what they meant. That decision satisfied him, and he closed his eyes to get some sleep. Chapter 22. The desolate plain was silent in the pre-dawn light, that moment when the eastern sky shifts from black to purple to announce the coming of the sun. He opened his eyes to the absence of noise. The crickets and tree frogs had been usual companions as he traveled in search of the escaped men. Their silence told him he was not alone, and not being alone, he had to decipher if it was man or beast who caused the quiet. His flinty eyes flicked to the smoky pile of ash that was his campfire. There were no embers glowing red against the black earth to betray his position. He glanced toward the trees and the picket line strung between two thick saplings where his horse was tied. It stood, head down, as quiet as the crickets. He felt a pressing urge in his bladder and cursed his own biology. Nature called and it did not care that he might be under scrutiny or imminent attack. He slipped the blanket back and shifted up, waiting for his movement to draw attention or some interaction that seemed out of the ordinary, but nothing happened. Eldridge stood and moved to the far side of the horses as the purple-gray sky turned a brighter shade of pale, giving just enough detail to his surroundings that he could make out the bark on the tree, if not the actual color. He let go and cursed again the inopportune timing of the necessary event which required him to exist in a state of awkwardness for several long moments. His stream bouncing off the earth was the only sound, loud in the silence of the dawning morn, and he cursed that under his breath as well. He caught movement out of the corner of his eye and whipped his pistol out, ready. But whatever it was disappeared or froze, and his eyes grew dry as he watched and waited. Eldridge finished his business, and used his left hand for the resettling of his breeches to their proper place, when a shadow detached from the ground several paces in front of him, followed just as fast by a half-dozen more. He could not note the details of their face or dress, just that an ambush by a superior force was upon them. He stumbled back. "Indians!" he screamed as he stumbled back to camp. He dug his rifle out of the pouch and slammed it against his shoulder. "What you doing?" Rufus knocked the rifle up into the air. "That ain't a nice way to greet our guests." "Guests?" Eldridge spun around in a slow circle, hand on the butt of his revolver as young warriors seemed to appear out of thin air. There were too many of them by God, but he was going to make a show of it. Indians respected that kind of death, a good death that took half or more of them on a great hunt in the sky. He reached to his shoulder ostler with his other hand and moved his lips in a faint memory of silent prayer. "What are you doing?" "Praying," he barked. "Damn sure you ought to be doing the same thing." Rufus snickered. The laugh was so out of place it caused Eldridge to pause. Perhaps the sight of so many Indians had driven the man to madness. But no, Rufus was walking across the clearing where they made camp and holding up a hand to one of the young men. He held up his hand in return, and when not one of them peppered the two men like pincushions, Eldridge rose from his crouch and waited. He kept his hand on his gun though. There was being sensible, and then there was just plain stupid. "Put on a pot of coffee, will you?" Rufus called over his shoulder. "I ain't drinking a pot of coffee," Eldridge snapped. "It's not for you." Rufus led the young man back to the smoldering coals of their fire and fed it small twigs and branches until it crackled under the growing sunlight. "It's customary to share with them," he explained as he set a tin coffee pot on to boil and dug a side of jerky out of a saddlebag to pass around. Eldridge sat on his saddle with a grunt. "We don't got much to share." "Then we'll share what we do have," said Rufus. "It'll come back to us tenfold." "Anyone ever tell you, you sound like a preacher?" Eldridge grumbled. "I've heard that before." "Yeah, well I ain't never heard of no black preachers out here, and we're not about to start." Chapter 23. Judge meets the schoolmarm upon discovering his love of literature, invites him over for dinner. Judge Parker marched along the boardwalk, boots tapping out a staccato rhythm on the rough-hewn planks. His mind was on the escaped men, and more importantly, on the man or men who had allowed that escape. He was unsure if it was a cabal set against him, a group of men who engineered the running of the town, or the act of a single man bent on freeing his friends, but the fact remained that men brought in under his orders were now free and loose in the Indian Territory. Parker had no doubt that Marshal Sample would return them. He had proven quite adept at the handling of trouble on the trip to Fort Smith, and if his reputation from the war were only half true, it would not be long before those felons would be in custody. Still, it bothered him. The act of not knowing his enemy was a troubling bit of information. An enemy known could be countered. It was the unknown that made prediction difficult. He paused as a dust cloud pillowed off the road from the hill and the shape of a stagecoach took place. It rolled on extra-large wheels led by a team of 4 strong quarter horses. A dusty driver sat on the right side, with a squat fellow on his left, a short-barrel shotgun resting across his knees. It was the second coach in 3 days, no cause for alarm but out of the ordinary enough that the people on the streets paused in their activity to watch the approach and delivery of occupants. Parker gave a quick wave to Ned at the store as he stopped sweeping to see who the coach disgorged, and noted the prim-looking red-headed woman that towered over the shopkeeper standing behind him. The 4 passengers who stepped out onto the dry dusty street had no one to greet them. 3 women paused on the step up to the boardwalk across the way and shared a moment to say goodbye. 2 of them made a beeline for the saloon and entered into the shadowed interior that Parker had yet to visit himself. The 3rd woman stared up and down the street, sharp intelligent eyes studying the layout and makeup of the small town. The 4th passenger was a rough-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who glared at the woman. It seemed he had a glare for everyone besides her as well. Parker watched him shove past her and stomp along the boardwalk to the far end of the street where he disappeared in an alley by the livery. The woman took a moment to arrange herself. Parker hopped off the boardwalk and avoided two cowboys on horses as they plodded through town. He made his way to her side and removed his hat. "Welcome to Fort Smith," he said. Her eyes were a brilliant shade of blue and sparkled like she was the holder of some secret joke. Her hair was a light shade of brown, heavily curled under a simple cloth square to keep the dust off. "Thank you," she smiled, white teeth beaming. It wasn't a perfect face, he noted. There was a scar on the corner of her eyebrow that marred the hair in a crooked white line, and a splash of freckles that would seem natural across her nose and cheeks, but instead dotted her hairline. "Delilah," she held out a gloved hand. Parker shook it and offered his arm. "May I accompany you to your destination?" She glanced up and down the street. "I fear my destination has yet to arrive." He raised an eyebrow in curiosity. "I'm to be the new school teacher," she explained. "And yet, I see no school building." "Then you are in luck," he said. "I'm Isaac Parker, the judge for the territory, and it so happens that I not only know where the school building is located, but there is a boarding house along the way where I believe a room has been set aside for you." Delilah took the proffered arm as he escorted her up to the boardwalk and then along under the shaded wood awnings. "Are you the patron?" she asked. "I am afraid I am not," he said. "That honor fell to the more permanent families in the town. Though not so newly arrived, I am as much a stranger here as you are." He stopped in front of a single-story building that stretched back from the roadway. It stood on a small intersection of an alleyway that ran from the clearing behind the main road all the way to the river. They could see young children scampering on the edge of the shallows where a sandbar cut across the water while a couple of people fished on the edge. The namesake fort towered on a hill overlooking the river, wooden palisades baking in the sun. "I'll allow you time to rest from your journey and get settled," said Parker as he ushered her into the boarding house entryway. It was a small box with a desk along one side and doors that fed off a long hallway that stretched to the back of the building. Several tables squatted against the wall next to an empty buffet where breakfast was normally served in the mornings. "It looks as though we are too late to break your fast, but if you will allow me to accompany you in an hour, I can introduce you to the cafe and a tour of your building." She blushed and curtsied. "I would be delighted and I thank you for your kind offer," Delilah answered. He tipped his hat and left her to check into her room as he resumed his brisk walk to his courthouse. A smile tugged at the corner of his face as he walked. He didn't notice Shelley standing in the shadows of the door to his saloon watching him from the far end of the roadway. Chapter 24. "Would you like a cup of tea?" "Tea? Do I look like an Englishman?" "I think you bear a passing resemblance to a great many Englishmen," she smirked and put a kettle on the stove to boil. "Do you know a great many Englishmen?" He pried. "My father took me to London when I was a girl. I was entranced with the place, and the people. But I only brought back a love of tea. Based upon your endorsement of books we both like to read, I'm inclined to take your word on the tea," said Isaac. He watched as she assembled the tray, then transferred the water to a delicate teapot. She transported the tray to the table between them and poured the weak brown liquid into a delicate cup. She dropped 2 sugar cubes from a bowl into the steaming water and gave him a spoon to stir with. Isaac swirled the contents of the cup and gave an exploratory sip. "Quite good," he answered to her raised eyebrows and was pleased to see her smile. Sarah pushed a plate of cookies closer to him. "They call these biscuits," she said. "Tea and biscuits. I would not expect this." He lifted one of the thin shortbread cookies and sniffed it before taking a bite. Hints of nutmeg, cinnamon and something else twirled on his tongue interspersed with bits of dried fruit. He chomped through 2 more before pausing to notice she had yet to eat just one. "I'm being rude," he said, shoving the plate back. "No," she smiled and pushed it to him again. "It gives me pleasure to see you enjoying it so. A taste of civilization is what I call it. I would call it a taste of heaven." She waved off the compliment, but he also saw a hint of blush on her cheeks that told him she enjoyed it as well. "I can't continue unless you have one as well," he stated. "I couldn't eat all of your delicacy alone after such a fine dinner." The color on her cheeks brightened. "I'm just grateful for the conversation, Judge. You can't imagine the level of discourse I've had out here so far. There are few educated men in town, but one must be careful of one's reputation." "Call me Isaac," he said and picked up another cookie to nibble. "Biscuit," he thought and took a bigger bite. Sarah smiled and reached for one for herself. They finished the plate and tea without further discussion and he caught her looking at the clock. Though it was only approaching 9, he knew that tongues would wag if he stayed much longer. A single man alone with a single woman in her house was cause for much talk, even if they kept the windows open and could be seen by the light of several lamps. "I must be going," he said and stood to say goodbye. She ushered him to the door, but not before securing a promise of another dinner and more biscuits, perhaps something a little more exotic this time. There was an awkward exchange of handshakes, though he longed to kiss her on the cheek, and she held an expectation of it. He wondered if her desire ran deeper, or if it was a habit picked up from the Europeans. He had been to Paris once and they all kissed on each cheek. The judge thought of this as he strolled along the plank boardwalk in front of the store, moving toward the room he had secured on the other end of town until he could have a home built. His mind was on the taste of cookies and the feel of her soft fingers in his hand as he stepped off the boardwalk to cross over an alleyway. A shot rang out and slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around to pitch on the ground. Isaac listened to bootsteps scuff away in the dirt, but didn't catch sight of the miscreant that winged him. Still, he played dead for a moment, just in case they were watching from the end of the alley and returned to finish their work. More boots pounded across the ground toward him and he rolled over to sit up in the dirt. "You all right, mister?" A young cowpoke bent over in front of him. Isaac opened his mouth to answer and passed out. Chapter 25. Marshal rides into a town where it's rumored some of the bad guys are. He goes into the saloon. "Any place around here I can let a room?" "10 cents, said the man behind the bar. He didn't bother to look up from the dirty glass he was rubbing with a dirty cloth. "That's a how much, not a where," said Eldridge. "What about a bath?" "10 cents, the man answered again and kept polishing. "And food?" "10 cents. "Steak and beans?" "10 cents. "Whiskey?" "Whiskey." "Aren't you the most consistent fellow a man could encounter off the trail?" Eldridge slammed a silver dollar on the bar and slid it down to the bartender. The man's hand swooped down to scoop it up and returned to polishing in such a practiced move that Eldridge thought for a moment he had made the coin disappear. He had seen a magician once in a visit to New York City that had done several tricks and delusions of that nature, and he had been quite impressed. "You want the meal before the bath or after?" "Now I thought words were going to cost me extra," Eldridge said. "After's fine." The saloon doors swung open and he turned to watch a big man step through. Not quite as tall as he was, but 3 times as wide and wearing a tin star. Eldridge let his coat slide open to show his star as well as free up his gun, just in case. "Marshal?" "That's what the badge tells me." The man held out a wrinkled piece of paper in his hand and passed it to him as he bellied up to the bar. "2 beers, he ordered. 10 cents. Eldridge read over the short telegram and folded it into his pocket. The sheriff offered him the second beer and the 2 men clinked the glasses together and took long sips. "Sorry about your judge," offered the sheriff. "He ain't dead yet." "Assassins. That's bad business. I suspect you'll be leaving." Eldridge watched the man out of the corner of his eye. "Not till morning," he answered. "I'm here on a warrant and besides, I've already paid for my bath and dinner." The sheriff nodded. "Anyone in particular you hunting?" "That's a peculiar way to put it," said Eldridge. The sheriff was on his left side, so he drank with that hand, and kept his right hand on his gun belt. It wasn't he didn't trust a fellow lawman. It was just most of the fellow lawmen in these parts tended to side with the outlaws he was after. They didn't know the marshal, just knew his badge. If they had a personal relationship with the bad guy, say they thought he was a good man who made a dumb choice, well, a sheriff might decide to hide that bad guy or send the marshal off on a wild goose chase. Eldridge didn't feel like hunting goose. He felt like a bath, a steak and a good bottle of whiskey. Maybe even a woman if the wares offered here were of a caliber he liked. "I'm looking for a fellow named Black," the marshal said. "Black? You know him?" "I know a lot of blacks. Farmer about 15 miles from here, and a rancher to the south." "They kin to each other?" "I don't suppose so, though with a name like Black they could be. Still, it's common enough in these parts." "I suppose it's common enough in the parts where you come from too." Eldridge nodded. "This particular Black murdered a man. You heard about him?" "I heard about him. You happen to know where he is?" The sheriff shook his head and drank the last of his beer in 2 big chugs before clinking it down on the wood. "But if I see him, Marshal, I'll tell him you're looking for him." Eldridge watched the man depart the saloon and glanced down at the bartender. "You would think he'd tell him to come see me. Save me some time." The bartender shrugged and polished. "Fella," said Eldridge. "You're going to wear through that glass you keep rubbing it with that rag. Go get me a bath. I paid you for it." The bartender set down the most polished piece of glass in the history of his saloon and scurried up the stairs to heat water. Eldridge reached behind the bar and grabbed the shotgun hidden there, removed the shells to his pocket, and put it back in the same place. He grabbed a second bottle of beer, twisted off the top and clomped up the stairs, following the sound till he found the room with 2 tubs and a wood stove in the back of the building. Chapter 26. Eldridge eats his steak, drinks his whiskey and woos a woman to join him in his room. As he walks upstairs, another door opens and Black freezes in the doorway. He drew his pistol, but Eldridge is faster and gets a shot into his chest before he can raise the gun. Black stumbled and pulled the trigger, filling the hallway with blue gun smoke. A second later he crashed down onto the floor. The gunshots had silenced the crowd below and Eldridge turned his gun on them to make sure no one was going to take a shot at him while his back was turned. The sound of a woman crying splits the silence. He glanced down. Beth sat on the floor next to Black, but she didn't weep for the outlaw. Instead she held a blood-stained hand to her arm where the dead man had shot her. Eldridge kneeled down next to her and held the bottle of whiskey to her lips. "Here, take a drink," he instructed. The young girl took 2 huge gulps before he pulled the bottle away. "You there?" he called to the bartender. "Get a doctor up here." The bartender grabbed a man and shoved him out of the door. Murmurs of voices in the bar below drifted up as the men watched the marshal. 2 men ran through the door, one carrying a black medicine bag. Eldridge turned his wounded bar girl over to the doctor, and grabbed a boot of the dead man. He dragged him along the floor and into his rented room against the edge of one wall. He pulled a blanket off the bed and covered the man up before returning downstairs. "You just going to leave him up there?" "He'll keep," said the marshal as he tossed back a slug of whiskey from his bottle. "I can set him up in the barn with sawdust," said the bartender. "You can pick him up in the morning." Eldridge took another sip of whiskey. "I bet that would cost me what, 10 cents?" Chapter 27. Eldridge walks to the barn where his horse is boarded and buys another horse from the corral keeper to haul the dead body back to Fort Smith. "Marshal?" The red-headed man licked his chapped lips. "That's what the badge says. A couple of friends of that fella you shot were here this morning." "They were? I boarded their horses overnight and they came here at dawn to get 'em. Woke me up. I'm sorry they disturbed your sleep. They don't seem like the courteous type. The thing is, Marshal, I overheard them talking about what they was planning to do. To you." Eldridge cinched up his saddle and tied the lead rope from the second horse to a saddle horn. "You planning on telling me what they had in mind?" "Well, Marshal, it ain't none of my business. But I figures since you bought a horse off me, and paid me good for boarding yours, I ought to tell you. That makes good business sense to me, I reckon. Them boys is planning to ambush you, Marshal, on account of what you did to Black." "There are they?" "That they are. Now I ain't the interfering type," said Forrest as he licked his lips again. "You ain't?" "No sir. Ain't never been my whole life. But seeing how you are a paying customer and they are not." He let it hang there, the gnarled fingers of his lame hand working the greasy strands of hair over his bald head. The marshal dug into his pocket and flipped another silver coin toward the man. "I'm obliged." The man caught the coin and secreted it into his vest pocket before he ambled back into the shadows of the barn. Eldridge sighed and pulled the Henry from a pouch on the side of his saddle. He gets one of the me dead, wounds a second, but the third rides off. He throws the second dead man across the horse and sits the wounded man on top of the 2 bodies. "Now I know this is going to be slow going," he told the moaning man as he cinched the rope around his wrist tighter to the saddle horn. "But I'm not going to turn this horse lame just so you can see a doctor." The man moaned in pain again. "Also, I don't plan to listen to your belly aching the whole ride back to Fort Smith. I'd just as soon shoot you to shut you up." The wounded man clenched his lips tight, cutting the volume of the moan back but not quite cutting it off. "Well, I guess that will just have to do," said Eldridge. "For now." He went to the left side of his horse and swung up in the saddle. He pointed toward the fort and clicked his heels into the side of his mare so they took off at just faster than a slow walk. The man behind him grunted with each step, a tiny whimper and whine in time with the clip-clop of each hoofbeat. Chapter 28. Eldridge leads the horse along the trail. "Quit your damn belly aching," he called over his shoulder. His horse snickered and danced, tossing its head. The marshal slid his gun out of the holster and aimed it up the trail. "I can't see you, but the horse damn sure smells you, so you better come on out." He hunched over to make a smaller target. Rufus eased his horse onto the trail. "You make too much noise." Eldridge shifted in his saddle and holstered his piece. "Well, now it ain't me making all that fuss. He shot me, mister. Please, he shot me. I'm so thirsty. It hurts so bad." "Did you shoot him?" "Of course I shot him. Shot them other 2 fellas underneath him too. They were trying to shoot me, weren't they?" Rufus nodded and turned his horse to fall in abreast of the marshal as they continued down the trail at a leisurely pace. "Looks like you haven't had much luck," Eldridge chirped around a smile. "Not much," Rufus agreed in a stoic's voice. The 2 men topped a low rise. The marshal pulled his horse up short and ripped the Colt from its holster. 6 men sat astride a string of ponies on a picket line. None of them moved. "Good spot for an ambush," Eldridge growled. "But they're not doing it right. That's 'cause it ain't an ambush." "It's not?" Rufus shook his head and spurred his horse past the marshal. "If it was an ambush they'd be shooting by now," he said as he passed. "You can put your piece away." Eldridge followed him down the shallow hill and sat astride his horse under the cottonwood trees. Rufus bent down and untied the string of ponies. He wrapped the rope around his saddle horn and began leading them along the trail. Eldridge studied the men as they passed. Their hands were tied to the saddle, their feet tied together with rope that run under the horse's stomach. He pushed the brim of his hat and studied their features as they passed. He recognized them from their words. "Can you fellas help me?" the man on the horse behind him called to the other prisoners. Chapter 29. Eldridge and Rufus deliver their men to the jail. It's stuffed to capacity and more, men sleeping on the floor, sharing the bunks. "You got to feed us, you know," said Choctaw Charlie. "We got rights, you know." "No, Charlie, I do not know." Eldridge slammed the door shut and twisted the key. "I do know the fat one over there would feed all of you for a week, and I would suggest cannibalism if you're hungry, but after I check on the judge, you may not last a week. You may not make it to dinner." He left them to ponder their fate as he stomped out of the back of the jail. "I'm going to check on the judge," he informed Rufus. "Do you have this under control?" Rufus sat at the sheriff's desk with his feet and pulled a battered dime novel from his coat pocket. "Don't exert yourself none." Rufus nodded. "There are better things to fill your mind with, you know." Rufus nodded again. "I prefer the sound the wind makes or the noise of nature," he said. "But while I'm stuck in town, this will do." "I can get you one of my classics," Eldridge continued. "You want to read some of the Greeks? Is it in Latin?" "I don't speak Latin." "Do you?" Rufus shrugged and ducked his head back into the book. Chapter 31. Rufus glanced up at footsteps on the boardwalk outside of the jail. He eased a pistol up onto his leg, just under the tattered pages of the novel he was reading. There was a double knock on the door and Eldridge called out. "It's me." He ducked his head as he stepped through the door and closed the simple wood plank behind him. He smiled at the gun that still rested on Rufus' leg. "Why don't you go get yourself something to eat?" "I'm good to admit I've got a hunger," said the deputy as he stood up and stretched. Eldridge looked past him at the crowded cells. The men were scattered in various poses as they sought comfort on the hardwood floor, or the edge of the hardwood bed. The cramped conditions were ripe for complaint, yet one look at the hard set of the marshal's face made any who thought to speak think twice and bite their tongue. Rufus crossed the road listening for the clip-clop of hoofbeats or the jangle of reins that indicated he was about to get run down, but there was none. He took a big step up onto the boardwalk and pushed open the swinging doors to Shelley's saloon. He stepped to one side while his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Sunlight fought to leak through the smoke-stained windows. The smell of stale beer, perfumed women and stinkweed cigars lingered over everything, a permanent miasma that would leach into his clothes if he stayed long enough. 4 cowpokes were playing cards at a table near the piano against the back wall. They stopped their game and glared at him. Rufus ignored them and took a little table off to one side of the bar. "Steak," he called to the barkeep. The man scowled. He didn't like taking orders from a black man, even if it was just an order for food. Rufus tossed a silver coin up on the bar and dissuaded any verbal argument though. He put his elbows on the table and wished he had remembered to bring something to read while he waited. "You just get on out of here now." Rufus glanced up as one of the men playing poker stood back from the table and rested his hand on the handle of his pistol. "What you mean?" "I mean we ain't having no niggers in here with us." Shelley filled the open door to his office, but didn't intervene. He crossed both arms across his massive chest and watched like he was at a play and the men were actors on a stage. "I'm just trying to eat." "You ain't eating in here," said the one in the blue shirt sneered. That's how Rufus was categorizing them, sizing them up with his eyes. He supposed Eldridge would have shot 1 or 2, perhaps all 4 of them by now and kept waiting for his steak. The man was quick to action, if not anger, and killing these men would trouble him no more than killing a fly. Rufus wanted to be different though. He had to be different. It was a matter of pragmatism. Eldridge could get away with shooting a couple of white men at a time. Rufus on the other hand would pull a train car full of scrutiny for every white man he shot, and even if it was justified still ran the risk of a lynching. "I already paid for my meal," he explained. "Give him his money back," Yellow Shirt ordered the barkeep. The man clutched his pocket with a tight fist while the other slid under the plank wood bar. Rufus knew he was gripping a sawed-off shotgun under there and he wasn't about to give up his silver piece. That meant if he wanted to avoid violence, he was going to have to sacrifice the silver and the steak. "Damn it," he muttered and stood back slow from the bar, just so there was no misunderstanding. The cowpokes stepped back anyway, hands drifting down to their pistols. Rufus showed them his hands. "I'm leaving," he sighed. "Damn right you are." They followed him to the door, and then out onto the boardwalk, a crescent moon of danger herding him into the street. "And don't you come here again." Rufus turned and faced them, one hand holding his coat open, the other hooked over the rim of his belt. "That don't seem like a realistic proposition," he said. "Seeming as that's the closest place to the jail." Blueshirt jumped off the boardwalk and scuffed across the dusty street. "I said," he poked Rufus in the chest. "You ain't coming back in there." Rufus snatched his finger in his left hand and bent it back with a snap. Blueshirt dropped to his knees screaming as the finger he had pointed toward Rufus was now aimed at him. Yellowshirt and the other two went for their guns. "Hold it there fellas," a voice called out. Rufus had his pistol extended and aimed, but he didn't pull the trigger. A young man barely into adulthood stood in the shadows on the boardwalk with an arrogant set of his shoulders that hinted at a lack of experience and an extreme amount of confidence. He wore two guns on belts that crossed his waist, one on each leg, and his shirt was still shiny and fresh pressed. He had a circled badge on his chest that gleamed even in the shadows, as if he spent all morning polishing it to shine. "You the new deputy?" Rufus called out. "'Bout as new as you at marshalling," the man answered. The deputy moved up the street between the four men. He ignored Blueshirt writhing in the street, clutching his hand, careful of the dangling finger. "You ought to go get the doc to look at that," he advised the cowpoke. "And you boys ought to go help him." The deputy was a fresh-faced kid with sandy blonde hair and dimples that made him popular among the ladies. He grinned at the three cowpokes up on the boardwalk now, but the charm of his cheeks was lost in their acid looks. "This ain't your concern, deputy," the yellow shirt scowled. "That nigger done broke his hand." "I broke his finger," Rufus corrected. The others did not seem inclined to argue. Perhaps it was the pistol he held in his right hand, hammer cocked. "Finger, hand," Blueshirt said through a sheen of tears. "Can't use it now." "Go see the doc," the deputy warned again. The cowpokes seemed to like the odds at 4 against 1, but 2 on 1 didn't suit them, especially since it was the deputy now. Rufus watched them exchange glances and reassess their intention. They lifted their hands away from their pieces, jumped off the boardwalk and assisted their blue-shirted friend down the street, a litany of cursing and curses muttered under their breath. "You looked like you had that handled," the deputy watched them leave. "But I didn't want any bloodshed in the street." Rufus kept his gun out till the man turned a corner, then holstered it and offered his hand to the deputy. "I'm much obliged," he said. "Rufus." The deputy shook his hand and offered another grin. "Pete," he answered back. "You're one of Judge Parker's marshals." "Me and Eldridge for now." "I saw you both bring in a string of wanted men," said Pete. "That was a very admirable action." Rufus shrugged. "Judge said to get the job done, so we done it." He began to walk back to the jail, Pete in step with him. The door opened and Eldridge stepped out to watch him cross into the shadow of the building. "Did you eat?" "They asked me to leave," Rufus explained. "That didn't answer my question. I ran into some trouble. I was watching." "You didn't come out to help?" "You looked like you had it handled." Eldridge leaned against the wall of the jail and sipped from a brown bottle. "Besides, the boy came along to help." "You were watching through the window?" Eldridge shrugged. "I should have known," Rufus thought. The marshal would know he was going into the saloon, and he would be keen on any trouble from that direction. "He was a big help," he told Eldridge. The marshal pocketed the bottle. "Didn't help you get a meal though." He hopped off the porch of the jail and marched across the street. They watched him shove through the swinging doors. "What do you suppose he's doing?" Pete asked, a quiver of fear in his voice. He had averted one disaster on the street, but he wasn't sure if he was up to the task of stopping the marshal. "I suppose he's picking a fight." But Rufus was wrong. He and Pete waited for 5 minutes, and Eldridge backed out through the swinging doors. He juggled 3 tin plates of steak and beans across the street and passed them to the deputy, Rufus, and kept one for himself. Then he reached into his breast pocket and handed them each a fork. Sometimes, he took a bite of beans and swallowed. "You've got to say please." Chapter 32. Rufus moves his Indian wife and kids into town. Some townspeople treat him like crap. Chapter 33. "I've made a mistake," Rufus thought as he sat at the end of a well-set table. The meal was simple, just meat and garden-grown vegetables, but the invite had been sincere. Pete asked them to dinner, and Rufus said yes. The boy's enthusiasm and general good nature had led him to believe that it would be all right. After all, he had shared more than one meal with a white man out in the field. How was he to know eating at a table with that man's wife would be different? His own wife sat in stoic silence, but that wasn't out of the ordinary. He had, on more than one occasion, accused the woman of being made from stone for all of the emotion she showed on her face. Still, it was a damn sight better than the scowl Pete's wife wore during the whole meal. She was polite enough, he thought. But her demeanor, and the harsh look she threw in Pete's direction had left him feeling uncomfortable and longing for beans over a campfire, instead of peas on a plate. "Thank you for the invite," he said as Pete shook his hand upon leaving. "We'll do it again," Pete assured him, gripping his palm tight and pumping with the enthusiasm of a traveling preacher getting ready to pass the plate. Not likely, Rufus thought, but he kept it to himself. He figured young Pete was going to be in for a little talking to once he and his wife were out of earshot. But he was wrong again. They weren't even off the porch when it started. "I won't have a damn Indian in my house, Pete." She put a finger over her mouth, shocked that such a word would escape her lips. Pete slammed his mug of beer on the table. "I'm not going to have it. Not in my house. My daddy would never." "Your daddy is the damn preacher of the damn Methodist church. And he would be embarrassed." She started to scream. Pete jumped up and stormed out of the house. He slammed his hat on his head and stalked the street toward what would pass for the center of town. He didn't have a particular destination in mind, just let his feet carry him under flickering torches set into wood posts on the edge of the buildings. The red and yellow light cast sputtering shadows on the mucked-up ground, and Pete was careful not to stumble. The light in front of the saloon was brighter, torches bracketed the entrance and smoky yellow light spilling from the open door. He could hear a piano playing and the tinkle of laughter over glasses. She would kill him if she knew he was in a bar where whores were kept. The thought was fuel for the anger inside him and he didn't care what she thought. He wanted a drink, and he was a man, and she wasn't going to tell him what to do. He stomped through the open door and made for the bar, and if he didn't quite ignore the looks from the gritty men and painted ladies, he at least pretended he was unaware of them. He held up a finger. The burly bartender smirked through his brushy beard and slopped a glass of bourbon for the young man. Pete laid a coin on the bar to trade for the drink. He tossed it back and tapped his toe through the burn in his throat and down into his stomach. The burn turned into a warm feeling, and he knew that one more would quench his anger, like water putting out a fire, and two more would just make him mad again. He ordered one more and set down the coin. "Maybe we should tell you to get out," a voice sneered in his ear. Pete glanced at the man on his right. It was the cowpoke in the yellow shirt he had stopped in the street earlier that day. "Or maybe we should carry you out," another voice from the man in the yellow shirt answered from his other side. He could feel the press of the third man near his back and swallowed down a shiver of fear. They had him surrounded. "We think you don't know the rules about color around here," said Yellow Shirt. Pete could smell whiskey on his breath, and the stench of rotting teeth. "I think you fellas need to move along before things turn nasty." Pete tried to sound braver than he felt. "I think you need to shut the hell up." The man in the blue shirt grabbed him with his uninjured hand and whipped him around. The man behind him yanked a long Bowie knife from his belt and jabbed it toward Pete's gut. The deputy twisted in their grip and felt the blade slice along his side. The sharp tip slammed into the wooden bar and stuck. Pete kicked the man with the knife between the legs and put him out of the fight for a few moments. He squirmed his arm away from the man in the blue shirt and elbowed him in the face. The sound of his nose cracking broke louder than the ping of the piano. Blood erupted like a geyser from his nostrils and the man squealed. Yellow Shirt pawed at the pistol on his waist at the same time Pete did. The other man was faster. He drifted his gun up and grinned. A hole opened up in his forehead, and sent him backwards under a drifting cloud of blue smoke. Pete turned his pistol onto the shooter and dropped his aim when the long barrel of gun pointed at him. "Nobody makes trouble in my joint but me." Shelley moved the barrel from Pete to the man pawing at his private parts on the ground. "You're no longer welcome here," he informed the two cowpokes. "Help them find their way and do something with that." Shelley instructed the bartender who frisked money from the two survivors as he escorted them bodily through the door. "Thanks," said Pete as he holstered his weapon. "I keep my paying customers safe." Shelley smiled as he dropped his pistol to his side. Pete didn't ask if the cowpokes were paying too. He was afraid of the answer. "I ran those two off," the bartender told him as he returned and hoisted the dead man across his shoulders. "You can go home now if you want to." Pete gulped and nodded. He did want to go home. He checked the street as he stepped out and was comforted by the sight of Eldridge Sample leaning on the post by the jail, watching the saloon. He was so tall, the deputy couldn't see his face, but his long hand rested on the butt of his pistol. "You take care of the trouble?" the voice called out from the darkness. "It was taken care of," Pete said. Eldridge didn't say anything else and Pete moved on after a moment of waiting. He wondered if there was another fight waiting for him at home, and snorted out a humorless laugh. This one he might not survive. Chapter 34. "Do you know what I think, Marshal? I think you like killing people." I think it makes you feel like God. I think you like the power it gives you over life and death." Eldridge swigged his whiskey and his hand did not tremble. It was not the first time anyone had accused him of playing at God's work, nor he doubted it would be the last. "You think too much, Shelley." The saloon owner perched on the edge of the bar as if it was the only thing in the room capable of holding him up. He fit in the decor, like a cigar smoke-withered wooden effigy, creased face glaring at the room around them as cowboys, whores and gamblers made him money. He controlled it all, pulled the strings like a demented puppet master, but this man he could not. This man and his judicious counterpart sitting behind dais in the courthouse. It pissed him off. "It's a common failing among men of my intellect," Shelley sighed. "You should have been something more than a bar owner then. This world does not demand intelligence, Marshal, you know that. This world demands a swift hand and fast fingers, or men with backbone enough to hire others to do it for them. I think you know which camp I fall into on that particular subject." "There you go thinking again, Shelley. I am not fooled by you." Shelley turned his baleful glare on the Marshal. "I know what stews behind that stone visage you carry. I've seen your reading material, I've watched you watch this world. You are the worst kind of jester. You calling me a fool, Shelley?" Eldridge set the tumbler down and rested one hand across his chest. The bar owner did not fail to notice his right hand never left his belt, and now the left was too close to his second pistol. He had seen the Marshal in action too many times to know how fast he could draw, and his penchant for firing first, second and third before asking questions was the topic of their current discussion. "A fool, yes," Shelley sighed. "You are fooling everyone but me with your attempt at playing dumb. What I want to know is, what are you getting at? How do you mean?" "My meaning is clear, Marshal, and could be no more clearer even if I spelled it out for you. You are too smart to work for the judge, and yet you do. You are too smart to be a part of this folly of cleaning up Fort Smith, and yet you are. And you are too dumb to take an offer from a friendly hand, an offer that can make you a wealthy man, an upstanding citizen of this community. Yet you don't. I say again, what are you getting at? The judge is here to clean up this town." Those are his words. "Personally, I don't give a damn one way or the other. A man asked me to do him a favor, watch over the judge. I respect that man, Shelley. He's a friend of mine. He saved my life in the war. When a man saves your life, you owe him a piece of that. Like doing small favors. So I ask you this. What do you owe me?" Shelley fumbled. "You haven't saved me, Marshal." Eldridge patted the gun on his right hip and smiled. "But I think I have." He finished his whiskey and left the man to ponder that. Shelley stared at the back of the departing Marshal for a long while, and even after he had left the noisy saloon, he kept on staring at the space he had been in the doorway. He felt as if he had escaped some great calamity, a tornado or earthquake, but settled the feeling with a bottle of whiskey and one glass that he carried into his office and drank alone behind a closed door. Chapter 35. "How's the arm?" "Hurts," Isaac answered. "Getting shot does that." "You've been shot before?" "Twice," said Eldridge. He lifted a bottle and dripped brown liquid into the 3 glasses on the tabletop. "Still hurts when it rains. I have that to look forward to at least. Wait till it snows." "It's worse when you're out in it?" asked the wide-eyed deputy. Eldridge sipped his whiskey and refilled the glass. "I try not to get caught in it. Much better to ride it out with Miss Laurie from the saloon." "Gentlemen," huffed the judge. "Let's save such tales for the trail. Let's stick to the business we have before us. You're the boss." Eldridge downed his second glass but didn't reach to refill it. "First things first," he said, and pushed a large leather-bound Bible across the desk toward Pete. "Swear in." Eldridge swore in the newest deputy marshal as Parker placed a silver star on the book. Pete grinned as he pinned it on and accepted the heartfelt slap on the back from Rufus. The judge spread copies of papers across the plank-top table set on 2 sawhorses on one side of the courtroom. Grim visages were sketched on each of the sheets, the words wanted printed on top, the crime on the bottom. Murder. Robbery. A litany of charges of the most vile kind. Parker shuffled through them. Eldridge leaned forward and grabbed a handful of papers. He took a third, and pasted the rest to Rufus and Pete. "You want us to light out and get them?" "Without shooting them this time," Parker advised. "Those men shot first." "Without killing them then," the judge amended. "I didn't shoot mine," Rufus grinned. "And I had a half-dozen." "And the help of the Choctaw Nation," Eldridge grumbled and pulled the brown bottle from his vest pocket. He poured a glass but didn't drink it. "There's a dozen men each." Pete shuffled through the papers, wide eyes growing even larger. "You feeling yellow?" "You can ride with me," said Rufus. Pete worked up one side of his mouth in a half-smile and showed a dimple. "I don't care how it gets done," said Parker. "So long as you afford these miscreants their rights granted by the government." He shot a look at Eldridge. "I don't mind working alone." The Marshal swirled the contents of his glass. Chapter 36. Judge Parker sat at the desk in his chambers. His arm did pain him, especially when he held it at such an angle, but he wanted to complete the task he had set before him. 3 pieces of fine stationery were laid out on the desktop, each with a time and place below the expressive cursive writing that indicated an invitation. He folded them into individual envelopes without sealing them and stuffed them into the breast pocket of his coat, then donned his hat to hand-deliver the invites. "I'd like to invite you to dinner." Color rose in her cheeks and she glanced away. "Not alone," he corrected as if suddenly realizing his error. "It's just your education would make you a genial conversationalist. Our efforts to bring civilization here makes finding companions." Delilah blushed harder and made a little giggle in her throat. "Companions is not the right word. I'm messing this all up. Let me start over. I would like to invite you to dinner at my home with several guests." She finally looked at him with sparkling eyes, slightly embarrassed that her cheeks gave away so much emotion. She felt a tingle of delight that the judge was blushing too. She reached out and put a hand on his arm. "Of course I will come," she almost purred. "It would be my delight." Parker's cheeks flushed a deeper shade of crimson, but he smiled at her and strutted toward the door. "The time is on the invitation," he told her. She watched him leave and then turned over the linen envelope in her delicate hands, studying his careful script with a practiced eye. She was pleased at his penmanship. Many boys she taught did not care to work on their letters, and chose instead to scribble out words and phrases that would serve them past the end of schooling. She thought it said something about the judge that he had such fine handwriting, and thinking of him gave her even more tingles. She couldn't wait for the dinner and a chance to speak to him again. The judge marched through town to the second street where a row of modest 2-room houses had been built. He zeroed in on Pete's house, opened the knee-high wood gate and took the stone path that led to the porch. He didn't get a chance to knock before the front door opened and Pete's wife stood in the doorway. "Judge," she beamed. "To what do I owe this honor?" He presented the invitation with a flourish. "Since your husband is out of town, I would like to invite you to a dinner party," he explained. "A party? I haven't been to a party in ages. I don't suppose there is much call for parties in a frontier town, but this is more like a dinner engagement," he said. "I've invited several people to join us, so that we may engage in conversation on the future of this town. And you want me to come? I respect your husband immensely, and he respects you. Pete said you have a keen mind, and ideas. I am a humble man and always in search of great ideas." She put her hand against her throat as she blinked back a sudden welling of tears. "Pete said that about me?" Parker nodded. "I didn't mean to upset you, miss." She took the invitation from him and held it to her chest. "I'm not upset," she told him. "I'm happy. It's not often a husband shares with his wife such a high opinion. Perhaps we can persuade him to do more of that," the judge bowed. "The time is on the invitation." "I don't know if I can come," she stopped him. She glanced over her shoulder at a noise in the house and shrugged her tiny shoulders. "My son. There will be a table for children," he told her. "I suspect he won't be the only one there." She nodded, and he could see the calculations going through her head as she tried to divine the identities of other guests. Parker tipped his hat and wished her a good day as he went to deliver the next invite. He made his way to the riverfront street, and noted the rows of canvas tents and wood shacks that looked as if they would blow over in a stiff wind. The tents were large affairs, surplus from the war by the look, canvas patched with deerskin, or leather depending on the owner. The shacks were cobbled together from driftwood and cast-off pieces of lumber from the Better Homes construction above the bluff. Here the tents were out of sight of the fort, and he could see boys fishing in the river for dinner, and younger children playing in the dirt in front of their tiny homes. He stopped in front of one tent, larger than the rest, raised on a wood slat floor that offered additional protection. It looked different too, covered with buffalo skins and a bear skin above the opening. "Hello?" he called toward the inside. Rufus' wife opened the flap and stared at him with a stoic look on her face. "Hello," he said. "I'm Judge Parker. I know who you are." He held out the invite and she took it from him, and turned it back and forth in her hand. "I can't read." "I am having a dinner at my home," Parker explained. "I would like for you and your child to come." She nodded. "Why? Why you?" "Because you are wed to my deputy marshal and I seek your input on bringing civilization to this town. Pete informed me that you had dinner at his house." "Your people do not think I am civilized," she told him. "They are not my people," he said. "But my people are coming, and bringing the railroad with them. You will see that our newer population has a more open-minded approach to Indians." She stared at him. "It's at 6 o'clock tomorrow night. Do you have a way of telling the time?" Rufus told me of this. You can bring your son. She didn't say anything, just watched him with those dark eyes. Parker supposed she would make the world's best poker player, for her face gave away nothing. He tipped his hat. Until tomorrow then. She watched him walk away, watched the set of his shoulders and his steady gait. He walked like a warrior that she remembered from her youth, though he was much older than the men who went to battle then. Still, she had never been invited to dinner in a white man's house before moving to Fort Smith, and now it had happened twice. Rufus had promised her that things were going to change, and if they did not move as fast as the seasons, then it was the will of God, the Great Spurt. She closed the flap on her tent after the judge topped the bluff and disappeared. Chapter 37. Dinner. Judge talks about the progress of town, the plans for the city. He asks their ideas, listens to them. He tells them they represent three voices: the future, the conservative present afraid of change, and a past that is something brand new. Schoolmarm asks why he only invited women. "Let us not pretend that we don't know who the real power in the household is." He smiled and served tea into their cups. "Those are pretty words, Isaac, but the real power in this town is at the saloon, the Garrison, and with the men who surround our town." Isaac nodded and offered them sugar for their tea. Rufus' wife picked up a cube and crumbled it in her fingers. "What is it?" "Sugar," said Isaac. "From Florida. Taste." He demonstrated by licking the tip of his finger. She put her finger on her tongue and flinched at the sweetness. A large smile spread across her caramel cheeks. The judge leaned forward and used a spoon to put 2 cubes on her plate and 2 in her tea. He showed her how to stir it, and she smiled again as she tasted it. "These men represent the past," he said. "They wish for things to stay the way they are, and that is not going to happen. The railroad is coming in with it, a new way of life." "Change," said Rufus' wife. "Change, yes. But with change comes growing pains. I fear it won't be an easy transition." "I fear you are right," said the schoolmarm. Chapter 38. Parker is walking home after dinner with the schoolmarm. Shelley is out in front of his saloon. "Nice night for a walk, Judge." Parker almost leapt off the boardwalk. He hadn't seen the man in the shadows. Shelley leaned forward and puffed on a cigar. The orange tip glowed in the darkness, wreathing his head in haze of smoke. The judge could only see the man's dark eyes and the slant of light that leaked through the soot-covered windows. "I am enjoying it." Shelley nodded in the direction the judge had walked from. "Might have enjoyed it more if you had stayed where you were?" Shelley and the judge argue over the future of Fort Smith. Shelley wants to build a grand opera house on the river like one he's seen in New York City, full of dancing girls, whores and gambling. "That's not the direction we're going." "You think Fort Smith is better than New York, Judge?" "I think you have some serious misunderstandings of society." "I have a thorough understanding of society and human nature," Parker sneered. "What I don't have an understanding of is building a den of inequity to attract more degenerates to this fair city." "Who you calling a degenerate?" "You, Shelley." "I thought that was fairly clear." "I'm not one to shoot an unarmed man, Judge, but you're crossing a line." "Draw your weapon," the judge stated. "Strike me down." It was Shelley's turn to sneer. "You'd like that, wouldn't you? Then your guard dog would have a reason to come to my saloon and shoot me." Parker nodded. "Eldridge would see it as his duty to avenge me, yes. But I will leave you with this warning, innkeeper. The Marshal may not even need that reason. Your concern should be that the only thing holding him back from such an action is me." The judge turned his back on the saloon owner and continued the walk toward his house. Shelley stared after his departing back and tried to drill holes through his shoulder blades with his eyes. When that didn't work, he settled for spitting into the street, then tossing the butt of his cigar after it before returning to the noise and crowd of the bar. Chapter 39. A wagon train rolled across the ridge and sent up a plume of dust that drifted on the wind. Eldridge stood on the edge of the boardwalk and watched them roll in. There were 40 wagons, with 2 people on the buckboard in the front and countless others nestled under the canvas covers in the back. The sides were covered with supplies, as if the occupants had packed up all of their belongings in the world to carry with them on a westward trek. By the looks of it, they didn't have much. The men wore all black, with conservative black hats, simple white shirts and beards under their chins. "Mormons," he muttered into his cup of coffee, half between exasperation and a curse. The lead wagon paused in front of Shelley's saloon. One of the elders, Eldridge guessed, stepped down from the buckboard as Shelley emerged, flanked by Charlie the bartender and another one of his hired guns. Few words were spoken and the exchange seemed unremarkable to the Marshal. Shelley motioned Charlie to retrieve a wooden chest from the back of the lead wagon and the elder climbed back aboard. The saloon owner motioned them forward as the wagon train resumed. Charlie and the muscle followed Shelley back inside. Eldridge hopped down from the boardwalk and crossed in a break between the wagons. He stepped through the door of the saloon and moved to one side so that he wouldn't be a silo head in the doorway. Shelley paused in the act of pouring himself a whiskey at the bar. "Marshal," he said and waved a second glass from under the counter from Charlie. "Funny business," said Eldridge as he took the full glass from Shelley and swallowed it down. "You don't like Mormons?" Shelley growled. "Guess you don't know how many people feel about Mormons. Fact is, Marshal, I don't give a damn how people feel around here. I care about the Mormons' money. They pay in gold. I haven't yet seen the difference between Mormon gold, Methodist gold, or any other type in the world. As long as they're paying, they get safe passage through the city. Some might say they had the right to pass through the town without paying a toll." Eldridge indicated his glass and Shelley refilled it. "Toll, tax, fee," said Shelley as he sipped on his own tumbler. "It's been called a lot of things in history, Marshal, and everyone has had to pay the price at one time or another." Eldridge nodded. "Besides, it's not just to get through town. I'm refitting their supplies on the other side of the ferry. They ain't just paying for safe passage. And I'm just to believe you're wholly vested in the commercial aspect of their travel." Shelley snorted. "They're headed in a dangerous direction, Marshal. I can't be responsible for their safety and well-being in the wildlands beyond our horizon. You've been over there. How safe do you suspect it's going to be for them?" Eldridge glanced toward the west, as if he could see through the wall. Then he looked through the door as the wagons rolled through. There had been a Mormon rebellion in Ohio, a whole community set to fire. He wondered if these were the survivors, and if so, moving into the territory in search of a safer place to live their lives. "Those the people that have more than one wife?" Laurie joined them at the bar. "Hell, Shelley, you could have been one of them." In another life, he took another drink. "I almost was." He poured 2 more drinks. "You heading out to hunt down some more bad guys? Friends of yours?" "I don't have any friends, Marshal," Shelley toasted. "Happy trails." Chapter 40. Eldridge stepped into the dim interior of the room and looked around for Laurie. He was dirty from the trail, dried blood from one of the bodies still on his hand. He needed a bottle of whiskey and a bath, in that order, but he wanted to see her first. She sat in the darkness in a corner at a table by herself. "Bottle," he called to Charlie and picked it up as he passed. Shelley stood up from the desk in his office and moved toward the door. "Eldridge," he called out, trying to slow him, but the Marshal ignored the man. There was something wrong with Laurie's face. He saw as he approached that she had been crying, 2 black circles under her eyes, blood crusted under her crooked nose. The side of her face was purple and yellow, and she ducked her head away so he couldn't see her. The Marshal slammed the bottle on the table and it split into 3 pieces, showering the floor with a gush of whiskey and glass. "It wasn't me," Shelley called out to him. "Me neither," said Charlie. Eldridge went down on his knees in front of her and lifted her face to make her look into his eyes. Her lids were swollen and red, the bruising fresh. "You can't look at me like this, Eldridge," she mumbled through busted lips. "I can damn well do what I please," he said softly. "And it pleases me to look on you. I can't work like this," she sobbed. "No one's going to pay for a busted whore. That what Shelley told you?" She nodded. "Well, he is a fine bastard, isn't he?" She tried to grin but it hurt. It pained him to see her flinch and he winced. "Why don't you tell me who did it?" She pointed to a table in the far corner of the bar. 3 cowpokes sat around it, as dirty from the trail as he was. There were 2 bottles of whiskey on the table and beer glasses in front of each of them. They played at cards, and smoked thin cigars, and didn't pay attention to anyone else. "The fair-haired one," she said. Eldridge stood up, his duster flapping out as he twirled around and marched across the room. Shelley tried to head him off, but it would have been better to stand in front of a locomotive. "Marshal, trouble is bad for business," he tried to say. The saloon owner reached out a hand to stop him, thought better of it and moved out of the way. Eldridge stomped to the table, pulled out his gun and shot the fair-haired man between the eyes. A hole opened up in his forehead as he flopped over backwards in the chair. The gunshot ushered in silence as everyone in the crowded room watched. "Any of you others want to hit a woman?" The other 2 cowpokes held up their hands. A puddle of urine spread from the man on the left to join the dead man's body on the floor. Eldridge turned to the silent room. "That goes for all of you," he shouted. "This here is the only announcement and warning you're going to get." He spit on the dead cowpoke. "Get him out of here," he ordered the man's friends. They scrambled out of their chairs and dragged the dead body out of the saloon. Eldridge watched them go, then stalked back to Shelley. "If you let it happen again, you're answering for it." Shelley held in a gulp. He stared up at Eldridge and worked on being defiant, worked on keeping his face plain, hiding his fear. It almost worked. The Marshal didn't call him out on it. Didn't say anything else. He pulled a silver coin from his vest pocket and flipped it in the air. Shelley snatched it and slipped it into his own. Eldridge took Lori by the hand and escorted her upstairs to her room. "Eldridge?" "Yes, darling? Are you ever haunted by the things you done?" He stroked her long hair between the tips of his fingers, as he stared at the shadows on the ceiling from the flickering gas lamp. "I have done things that would haunt many men. But not you? I do think on them. They don't bother you none?" He rolled over so that the tip of his nose touched hers and stared into her sapphire blue eyes. He could see a faint reflection of himself looking back at him, and for a moment wondered which was the better version. "I tend not to be bothered by the things I have done," he told her. "There's no use in it. I am. Sometimes. Did you know you were going to be a lawman when you were growing up?" Eldridge rubbed his fingers down her back and caressed her ample bottom. His long arms reached down her leg and back. Lori shivered under his caress. "I wasn't always a lawman. It is something I came to lately. You don't act much like a lawman." She leaned in and nibbled his chin. "Fact is, you seem to have more in common with some of the men you bring in. Perhaps that is what makes me such an effective lawman." He brushed his lips against hers as his fingers delved between her legs. "I didn't know this is where I would end up," she whispered when they finally broke free. "Here with me? In Fort Smith. I was in St. Louis before. And you are here now. The past is gone, it's a ghost and unreal. The future hasn't happened yet." His fingers kept moving. "The only thing we have is this moment." "That's beautiful," she said. "Don't stop. This moment here between us," he whispered and moved in for another kiss. "All you can do is take pleasure in the now, experience the present." He rolled her over on top of him so he could see her and watch. "I had my plans for my own place before," she rocked back and forth. "That's my future. But now," he grunted, "I still want my own place." He watched her eyes dart to the corner of the room, then land back on his. She bit her lip, and he thought she was stifling her pleasure, but then he realized she was thinking a different line of thought. "I've been saving," she whispered. There it was, he thought. She let him in on one of her deepest secrets. A whore shaving money from her boss was a big one. He reached up a hand and pulled her down on top of him so her ear was next to his, and he was impressed she kept going, kept moving for him. "I won't tell," he nipped her earlobe. She wrapped around him then, arms tight as they bucked together until it was over. Chapter 41. Silas Howard shifted in his saddle and stared at the bend in the trail. He wondered at the formation of it, the necessity to put the twist in what otherwise would have been a straight direction toward the setting sun. Perhaps it was an ancient stream bed or something as innocuous as a rattlesnake that could not be moved. Ancient Indians shifted their movement to avoid whatever it might have been, and over the years, 1,000 other set of feet packed the trail and marked it. Wagons following the trail turned the movement into something more permanent, until it was established that the bend in the way could not be moved. It was the perfect spot for observation, he noted. And when needed, for ambush. He was garrison commander at Fort Smith, and a man proud of that fact. He had seen battle in the war between the states, and earned rank that led him to the backwater posting on the western frontier. But he was not bitter for it. He was a man of opportunity, if anything. The saloon owner in town kept him well in whiskey and women, a tithe he felt deserving of his position. That same man also kept him fed with information, the coming and going of men of importance on both sides of the law. This new judge had him worried. They had met on a couple of occasions when the military crossed civilian paths. But small rebellions in the Indian territories had kept him afield until recently. He returned to find a treat awaiting him. A big buxom brunette and the whereabouts of a treasure-rich wagon train. Normally, Howard wouldn't deign interfere with pioneers setting out for the West. But these were Mormons. He hated the cult. Howard listened to the horses and men behind him for a moment. The sun was high in the sky, shifting over from midday for the long run into afternoon, and they were all anxious. The first of the wagons rounded the bend. "Ready the men," Howard ordered his sergeant. Taft was built like a barrel with a handlebar mustache that obstructed his plump lips. Under normal circumstances, he would order the bugler to sound charge, but not in this case. In this case, they were moving under stealth and disguise. "On my mark," Howard's mouth stretched into a grimace of anticipation. He raised a notched sword and swung it forward. The cavalry surged forward in a silent charge and descended on the wagon train. They brought hell with them. Chapter 42. The day had dawned cloudy, but a wind from the south pushed the clouds away to reveal brilliant blue skies and a blazing sun. It would have seemed too hot to be outside, but the breeze made for a pleasant morning. Not as pleasant as the company, Parker thought as he glanced at his companions. They were piled into Rufus' wagon rolling west toward a meadow he knew would make a perfect spot for a picnic. "But won't it be dangerous?" Delilah had asked when he invited her, and the rest of his dinner companions for the day. "What is life without a little adventure?" he had answered, and didn't bother to reveal that he rode with a rifle under the buckboard and a pistol by his side. There might be danger, yes, but the reputation of the hanging judge and his marshals had pushed a lot of that element further west. Further than he planned to take this little sojourn, and so worry was on the low end of his concerns. Parker was mostly concerned with the feeling of the young schoolteacher pressed against him, her leg tight to his, the feel of her arm against the side of his body. It could all be explained due to the tightness of space on the seat. There were 3 of them sitting up front, while Rufus' wife sat in the back with the 2 boys. There simply wasn't room to spread out. That didn't mean he could not relish the feel of her against him though, nor forego the rush of sensation her presence suggested to him. It made his heart beat a little faster and the sun seemed brighter, the landscape made more beautiful by the feel of her next to him. There. Parker thought she pointed to black clouds that darkened the horizon. But he had never seen clouds that moved like that. He pulled the reins to shift the horses in that direction. "Should we ride into a storm?" Delilah asked from his side, echoing that she had assumed the shadows were clouds too. "I don't think it's a storm," he said. He could hear the raucous cawing as they wheeled closer. A murder of crows fought and buzzed over a long stretch of ground, marred and covered with splashes of dried crimson streaks and mounds of what once had been bodies. "Stay here," he turned the wagon around before climbing down. "Keep them from looking," he said to Alma. She stared at the mayhem with unblinking eyes, but did as he said. Parker reached for the rifle under the buckboard and jacked a shell into the chamber. He didn't see any movement of the mounds on the ground, just the flapping and screaming of birds as they hopped, fought and flittered from one body to the next. The rifle was just to make him feel better. He stalked to the edge of the carnage, but could go no further. He had seen a few battlefields, but this was battle. This was slaughter on a scale he had never seen before. Men, women and children were shot, gutted, ripped open and left in the open. He could see arrows jutting from a few of the wagons, which made him think Indian. "No Indian did this," Alma said from behind him. The rifle went off and sent a bullet zinging through the murder of crows. Behind him, he hears Delilah and Sarah scream in fear. "Damn it, Alma," Parker cursed, shaking. Those stoic eyes watched him, neither sorry nor even caring that she had startled him enough that his heart was racing in his chest. "I see arrow, I think Indians," said Parker as he brought his breath under control. "The tribe does not use this many rifles," she explained. "We are not allowed to own them." Parker studied the bodies again. She was right. There were too few with arrows in them. It would mean that the warriors attacking the wagon train had to retrieve the spent and used arrows to reuse them to kill the next victim. It didn't make sense. There were plenty shot though. His eyes locked on a teenage girl holding an infant, both dead. One of her eyes was gone, courtesy of the winged denizens. The other stared at the sky, pain etched on her mottled skin. "We need to go," he said. He couldn't say why fear took hold of him, nor why his heart started racing again. He couldn't see anything around them, but the tone of his voice must have carried the weight of his fear because Alma rushed to the back of the wagon and vaulted in with the grace of a deer. As he was turning, he spied 2 things. A blue cavalry cap lay crushed under a body, and movement at the far edge of his vision. Parker cracked another round into the rifle and bent to retrieve the cap. It was a private's headpiece, battered, dusty and tattered. He shoved it into his vest as he aimed at the movement and stalked toward it. Parker drew up short and lowered the barrel of the weapon as he spied a small girl in the grass. Her dress was sheathed in blood, her face and blonde hair streaked with mud and dirt. Tear tracks cut down her cheeks and she tugged on the dress of a dead woman. He could see scrape marks in the ground under the woman, and surmised she had shielded the little one with her body, and covered her with it as she died. "Hello," he whispered as he scooped the girl up with one arm. She squirmed as he carried her away from the massacre. Back at the wagon, he passed her to Delilah and climbed up to take the reins. He still couldn't shake the fear that had gripped him. "Hold on," he warned the women and snapped the reins to urge the horses to speed. Chapter 43. On their return to town, he deposited Delilah and the child at the doctor's quarters and left Sarah and Alma to their own devices while he marched across the mottled street to the office he shared with the Marshals. He was, under normal circumstances, not a daytime drinker. But these were not normal circumstances and the vision of the massacre burned into his retinas, no matter how much he tried to steer his mind to other thoughts. He opened the side drawer on Eldridge's desk and pulled out a brown bottle of bourbon and didn't bother with a glass. Parker tilted up the bottom and 2-3 great swallows, until the burn in his stomach was strong enough to quench the desire to scream. Yes, he had seen men ruined before, bodies ripped to shreds by cannonball and musket fire. But those men had signed up for war, had consigned their mortal coil to the whims of the Almighty. This was different. There were women, and children, and small boys on that cusp of manhood. They had not asked for anything other than a journey west for a fresh start. A start that would be hard enough. The warmth from the whiskey spread through him, a calming effect he knew could quickly turn to rage if he fed it, so he set the bottle on the desktop. Better to confess the pillaging to Eldridge than try to hide the evidence. "I'll call an inquiry," he announced to the stack of wanted posters pinned to the wall. He wiped the back of his hand across his sweat-stained brow and snarled in unrequited rage at the sketches of men that stared back at him. "Cowards," he muttered. "Criminals. The lot of them." He wished at that moment to posses the Marshal's resolve to bring great harm to the man who did evil in this world, and even as the thought came into his mind, he decided to unleash him onto vengeance, his own personal demon personified to bring satisfaction to the matter. The moment passed as the heat in his stomach grew tempered. That was the thing with his anger, he considered. He could drizzle whiskey onto the fire that raged within him and fuel it into a conflagration that would blaze through the territory in righteousness indignation. Or he could do as charged by the President and seek a more civilized course. "Damn," he cursed. "Damned, I say." He spun on his heel and marched out of the office door. There was one man in town who, while not as omnipotent as he would wish others to believe, did hold more knowledge in the area of criminal activity than any other. Parker glared at the dark doorway to the saloon. Even as he decided to mount the steps and go inside, Shelley appeared from the darkness, stepping out into the shadowed eve of the awning. "Judge," he smiled. "To what do I owe the honor, Your Honor?" "There has been a crime to which I think you have knowledge," Parker growled. "I want to know what you know." Shelley put his hands on his sides, pulling back the lapels of his coat to reveal he was unarmed. "I don't see your pet Marshal backing you up, Judge." "I don't need the Marshal to ask you a damn question, you damned fool," Parker seethed. "Say it once more and I'll be thrice damned," Shelley snarled a smile. "You know that of which I speak," said Parker. "Tell me you had no hand in it." "I confess myself confused, Judge. I have no idea of what you speak." "The wagon train that paid you to pass through," Parker spit. "They lie massacred on the trail. All of them. Men. Women. And the children too. If you had a hand in it, I swear by God, you will not see tomorrow." Shelley glanced at the fort on the hill overlooking town and just as fast back at Parker. His look did not go unmissed. "Judge," he said. "You bring that big Bible of yours right down here and I'll swear on it, I'll swear on a whole stack of them, I had nothing to do with what happened to those folks that paid me for safe passage through my city." "Our city," Parker corrected. "Our city," Shelley snorted. "What happens to them after they cross the river? Well, we both know how savages are." "I didn't say it was Indians." Parker stood straighter as the two men locked eyes. "I did not say it was Indians that had done the deed." A movement in the dark interior of the doorway shifted, and Parker could see the bartender Charlie leaning into the half-light leaking in from the outside. It glinted off the oily double barrel of the sawed-off shotgun in the man's hand. All of the sudden, he didn't feel so safe. "Will you shoot me down here in the street and lay that at the feet of savages as well?" Shelley smiled like a shark he had seen on a fisherman's boat just in from the Atlantic once. "But Judge, I am unarmed." Shelley turned and sauntered back into his saloon. Parker stood in the street, impotent in frustration and rage, and angry with himself. After a moment, he too turned and walked away, the muscles in his back clenched tight as he waited for a shot that never came. Chapter 44. "I will discover what happened," he yelled after the garrison commander. The commander turned on the heel of his shiny boot and lifted one eyebrow. "I find that highly unlikely." He continued to march down the street. Delilah stepped out of the general store holding the hand of the survivor. The little girl started whimpering when she saw the garrison commander. "What's wrong with your child?" he asked. "She's not mine," Delilah confessed. "She survived the Mormon massacre." That stopped him. Commander glared at the little girl. She hid behind the dress of the school Delilah as he leaned in for a closer look. He reached out a hand for her and the girl squealed, backed into a wall, eyes darting left and right as she searched for a way to escape. He grabbed for her, the shoulder of her dress catching in his fingers, and yanked her away from the wall. "You little animal," he seethed. Delilah grabbed his arm and tried to pull him away from the little girl, off of her, but he shoved her against the wall. She slammed into the wood and collapsed to the boardwalk, choking and gasping for breath. A closed fist sailed out of nowhere and clock towered across his temple. He dropped the little girl and flew backwards off the boardwalk to land on his back in the street. Now he was the one gasping for breath. Eldridge hopped off the boardwalk and landed with boots on either side of his chest. Commander pawed for his pistol. Eldridge yanked his own and shoved it into the man's nostril so hard, A trickle of blood began to leak down his cheek. "Keep on going for that piece," he growled. "I beg you." "Eldridge," Parker shouted. "We don't hit women in this town." Eldridge ignored the judge and kept shoving until bone cracked. "We don't hit children neither. Not if you understand me." Commander couldn't nod. The pistol kept his head shoved into the dirt. "That's enough, Marshal," Parker intoned by his ear. Eldridge glanced up and noticed the judge next to him. Marm had moved to the little girl and cradled the young one in her lap, soothing her by stroking her hair. "You think he's learned his lesson?" Eldridge stood up and put his injured left arm back in the sling. The commander crawled on his elbows and heels, backpedaling away from the marshal, blood trailing down his lips and chin. He reached for his pistol. The marshal kicked his hand away from the gun and stomped it into the dirt. Bones cracked and the commander shrieked. "I guess he didn't." The commander cradled his injured hand to his chest, face covered in blood. Eldridge reached down and relieved him of his colt. He saw Will staring through the window of the general store and motioned him out. "Get the doctor over for him." Will took off down the street running for the doctor. Parker checked on Marm. She stared at Eldridge as he towered over the fallen commander. "I'm glad you made it when you did." He nodded to his horse and 6 others next to the general store. 5 of the horses had outlaws tied to the saddle. The 6th had a dead body thrown over it, hands tied to feet under the horse's belly. "I'm just glad I made it when I did." Chapter 45. Eldridge deposited his quarry into the crowded jail, and ignored the pleadings of the men crammed in together. There was barely enough room for each of them to sit, let alone move. "This ain't right." One black-toothed man reached through the bars and grabbed for the marshal's sleeve. Eldridge snatched his arm through and plowed his chin into the metal crosspiece. The man's head snapped back, and he fell into his cellmates. "Court's in session tomorrow, boys," the marshal warned them. "I suspect there will be plenty of room after that." He left them to ponder that thought, make peace with their maker should they so choose. He doubted the lot of them could spell God, let alone pray to him, but the marshal did not concern himself much with it. The readings of Marcus Aurelius that Parker had loaned him gave credence to a personal philosophy he had developed after the war when he spent time on the trail hunting bounty. Let folks be. That's how he summed it up, and it was all he asked of himself. People were allowed to believe in what they chose to believe in, so long as they accepted the consequences of their actions. He had been at a crossroads once and could have turned to a path of thievery and a life of a bandit. Eldridge had no doubt he would have made an excellent criminal. He would have approached it with the same dedication and perseverance he did most things, and though some would say that those things came easy to him, they did not see the hard work and hours of dedication he put into it to make it look so. But at that important juncture of his life, he had chosen the law. Not that he didn't mind bending the rules a little bit in the law's favor. After all, it was the common good that mattered. Eldridge strolled across the street toward Miss Laurie's, his mind on drink and the book in his vest pocket. He watched a pair of figures further up the road walking in the direction of the fort. It was the commander and one of his soldiers, and they ignored him after a hate-filled glare in his general direction. Common good dictated he kill that man, he thought. Law and the judge said otherwise. It would come though, he knew, just as he knew he would soon be in the arms and legs of a warm woman in the brothel. He felt his lust rising, and wondered if he should wait to read until after, and even as he stepped up onto the porch, he wondered if killing had made him so randy. It had not done so in the past, so he chalked it up to timing. In from the trail, 6 men captured, 1 dead and 5 to hang, plus saving a woman and child to boot. Not a bad way to be pleased with oneself, he considered as he pushed through the door. That deserved a reward. Eldridge convinces Laurie to open up her own place. Talk to a few of the girls, but only the ones you can trust. "I don't have enough money," she told him. "Those girls ain't going to come without some guarantees and I have to buy us all from Shelley." "How much do you have?" "Enough for me." "Make the plans," he told her and kissed her on the forehead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded set of bills. "This is what I have for now. I'll return with the rest." He leaned in for another kiss, and she held him tight, running her hands through his hair, down his shoulders. He let a hand drift lower and rubbed her chest, as if absorbing the memory of it through his fingertips until he could touch her again. Chapter 46. Eldridge found Parker in the courthouse, which was the first place he searched for the man. "You been home yet?" Parker leaned back in his seat and rubbed his tired eyes with a fist. "There is much work to be done, Marshal." Eldridge pulled up a seat and folded himself down into it. "That is the reason for my visit." "What, Eldridge, you don't enjoy my company?" Parker answered with a smirk. "Go on. We've been going after these scoundrels and getting paid up when we can. But the railroad and banks is offering good money for some of these sons of bitches. I say we go after them first." "This is unusual, Marshal. Are you hard up for currency?" "You could say something like that," he told Parker. "I am in a capitalistic mood." Parker shuffled through the papers and sorted them on his desktop. He arranged them by reward amounts, highest to lowest. "These are the rewards from the railroad," he explained. "The higher the reward, the worse the adversary. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. You may meet the devil out on the trail. These are hardened criminals of the worst kind. We've brought in worse before." Parker nodded. "And watched them hang. I'll see to it these men join their predecessors, Marshal. But I urge you to proceed with caution. A trip for one of these men could take all of your concentration. It's only right that you bring them back alive to stand trial." "Dead or alive," the warrant says. "Alive," ordered the judge. Chapter 47. He pulled his horse up short at the top of the ridge and stared at the empty landscape in front of him. This far into the territory, the trees thinned out to skinny things no larger than branches compared to some of the ancient oaks he had seen before. They were hardy though, clinging to the dust and dirt against strong winds in the winter and a merciless sun in the summer. He pushed his hat back and used a damp bandana to wipe the dust off his face and eyes as he squinted at 6 wanted papers he pulled from the pocket of his coat. They were an ornery-looking bunch, even in the sketches that he knew were just about as realistic as some of the tales he heard about himself from the war. He had done things, yes, things some men considered impossible or unlikely, but he knew the men who said those things were the kind of bastards who stayed too far behind the line and second-guessed anyone on anything. They had no real experience upon which to base their opinions, and no true learning from history both current and ancient to draw on. Instead they offered words in hot air, like the gusts of wind that tugged at the bundle in his hand. Worth about as much too as far as he was concerned. These men were hiding out here, he knew that much. Rufus shared the intelligence with him before he lit out, garnered from his network of Indian spies. The thought of it made Eldridge chuckle. Rufus knew more about the goings-on from the far side of the river than any man east of the Arkansas. Hell, his wife Alma probably knew more than he did. Their knowledge was going to help him, and he appreciated it. It gave him more than a general direction to point, it gave him a starting-off place. The territory was dotted with hundreds of canyons, small valleys and hidey holes this gang of outlaws could hide in. Rufus narrowed it down considerably. Eldridge tucked the papers back into his coat. It was a few more miles to the outpost where he would resupply, and a few more miles beyond that where he expected to find them. He glanced at the sky. The horizon was clear in front of him. He knew storms could come up fast, but from this vantage point, he could see as far as the blue stretched, all the way to the gray edges that turned a shade of purple on the spectrum, where earth and sky met. The only storm out here today was him. He rested his hand on the butt of his pistol and clucked his tongue to ease his horse down the escarpment. It was time to get it done. Chapter 48. He deposited a thick stack of bills on the small round table next to her simple bed. Lori reached out a hand that hovered over the stack, afraid to touch it lest it might disappear. "It's real," said Eldridge. He was still covered in trail dust and grit from the long ride down from St. Louis. "How did you come about such a sum?" She stared at it, mesmerized. "I followed bad men back to where they were hiding from their bad deeds and I carried their bad bodies up to the railroad office for the reward." She did pick it up then, slender fingers ruffled through the collection of large bills. "Such a sum," she said, and she looked at him. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head and eased back in the chair upon which he sat. "I could use a bath and a shave." He rubbed the coarse stubble that coated his chin. Lori dropped the stack of paper back on the table and began the preparations for the copper tub in the corner of her room. "I don't want you to make a mistake, Eldridge." She helped him into the tub and worked a piece of scrap cloth across his chest and arms. "Then I fear you are too late, my darling, for I am a man of many mistakes. The kind of mistake where you think I'm a whore with a heart of gold," she said as she unfastened his trousers and reached her warm hand down his pants. "I do not have a heart of gold, nor do I in fact have a heart." "You are heartless," he moaned as she worked her hand back and forth. "I will not fall in love with you, or any man. I do not look for a man to rescue me like some hero in a children's storybook. As soon as you are asleep, I'll go through your wallet and give myself some extra just because I want to." Her hand worked faster. Eldridge reached for her waist and lifted her on top of him. "You can have the damn money," he grunted. "I'll make more. And as for being heartless, we shall see what use we can make of the empty space." He thrust up inside her then, and she squeaked. His long fingers worked over the bodice of her corset, deftly stripping the bows of their knots as she stared at him with piercing eyes. "This won't end well for you, Marshal," she purred. "I've seen that look on a man's face before. That cow-eyed look of a dolt falling in love." Eldridge bounced them on the bed, as she ground on top of him. "I think this will end. Very well. For me. That made her smile, and they finished the rest of their coupling in if not quite silence, then graceful grunts, moans and whimpers of pleasure. Chapter 49. He buys a house for Lori in the nice part of town. "This is your place," he told her. "Your new place. But you paid for it. Are you planning on being partner?" Eldridge shook his head. "This is all yours." Lori sets up shop in the new house with 2 other girls and orders 6 more from New York. Chapter 50. Some people preferred the morning air, but Shelley generally found those types of individuals on the annoying side. A saloon keeper ought to like the night, he thought, since that's when the majority of his business was conducted. Not that there weren't those who enjoyed a drink and a poke during daylight hours. He nodded at 2 men as they entered his establishment behind him. He stood in the shade on the boardwalk under the overhang and watched the roadway. Sounds of new construction cut across the town. It was growing, he thought. Not so wild as it once was, and being civilized. He hated civilized. Civilization meant rules and laws, and men like Judge Parker and that damn pet lawman he kept off-leash. The new railway depot was framed in, next to the track bed. The tracks had yet to be laid, he observed, though the men were only several miles out of the town. They were frequent patrons of his establishment, and their money was regular, which he liked, even as he wished they wouldn't bring all of the elements of civilization to these parts. Shelley sighed. Maybe it was time to head west. There were still wild places that drew the kind of men he wanted to deal with, the kind of man he considered himself. Wild men. He saw the shadows of men coming from the other direction and shielded his eyes against the glare of the almost noonday sun. 2 more lawmen hauling in a string out outlaws rode past him. The black one and the kid he thought Lark had under control until he went to work for the damn judge. Rufus tugged the brim of his hat in a respectful nod and Shelley snorted as he returned it. At least that one knew to show a little respect. The kid wouldn't even look in his direction. The captives were a sorry lot, he saw. Several faces he recognized, but they refused to look up at him. "Cheer up, boys," Shelley called. "And count yourselves lucky these 2 brought you back alive. It is a privilege the other Marshal has denied to many." Rufus clucked the horses a little faster to avoid any particular confrontation, but Shelley said no more. He watched as the deputies delivered the men to the jailhouse and escorted them inside. There didn't seem to be enough room for them all in the tiny 2 cells, and he wondered how they planned to manage it. Shelley hopped down and crossed the street, a warning from his mother tickling the back of his mind. He knew what curiosity did to the cat. He stepped through the jailhouse door like he owned the place, and smirked. At one time, he had owned the sheriff and that amounted to pretty much the same thing. As expected, the cells were full. The rest of the men were handcuffed to the bars. "Don't get too comfy, boys," Shelley said. "A docket this crowded puts the judge in a swinging mood." "Get out of here before I lock you in there with him," Pete said. Shelley nodded as he strutted out of the jail. A closer look at the captured men set his mind a little more at ease. None of them had been in his saloon in a long time, so he wasn't going to be out of any money at their imminent demise. Chapter 51. Parker glared at the list of miscreants in front of him. He cursed under his breath at the success of his marshals. President Grant had tasked him with cleaning up the outlaw problems in the Indian Territory west of the Arkansas River, but he had no idea his choice of men to carry out the task would be so effective. There were 18 men set for trial today, but Parker knew the outcome of at least 10. These men were going to swing. Their crimes were murder, and the witness testimony had been collected. At least Eldridge did a lot of the hangman's role out in the field to save him time at the bench. Parker shook his head. These men deserved a trial, all of them. He believed in the law and shouldn't shortchange them their due justice, even if the outcome seemed preordained. "Marshal," he motioned to Eldridge and led him to the corner of the room. "Judge? I fear my mind is not on the proceedings today," Parker confessed. "I can take the lot out back and save us a whole lot of time." Eldridge's hand drifted to the handle of his revolver. Parker shook his head. "No, these men deserve a fair trial," he stated. "They didn't give the men and women they murdered much of one." "I know," Parker sighed. "That is one of the thoughts that is distracting me from the task at hand." Eldridge studied the judge with his ice-cold eyes, weighing and appraising as he tried to determine what exactly was bothering the men. "The massacre," Parker confessed. "I need to know more about it." "What's to know?" Eldridge shrugged and stretched to his full height. Inside, he left his hat off, but his long frame still carried his head close to the high ceiling. "You know who did it. You know how they did it. But I can't prove it," Parker hissed. "And lacking proof, I can't have it prosecuted." "You know how I would handle this?" Eldridge asked. "You want me to?" Parker chewed his lip for a moment and shook his head. "This needs to be done right," he said. "Can you gather evidence?" "I'll be honest with you, Judge. Detecting ain't exactly my strength. If we can find a modicum of proof, we can do something about what happened." Eldridge shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Legal?" He double-checked. "I would like for it to be illegal," Parker answered. The Marshal studied the judge's face for a moment, searching for hidden meaning. There was no. Parker was on the up and up. He wanted justice for the fallen Mormons, and he wanted it the right way. Which meant Eldridge needed help, and he sure as hell didn't like being in that position. "I know who to ask," he told Parker. The judge clapped him on the arm and seemed to stand straighter, as if a weight was lifted off his shoulder. Eldridge supposed it was. He had transferred the burden over to him to get the job done. "I'll be gone a couple of days," he said. Parker nodded and went back to the bench to adjudicate, now that his mind was clear. Eldridge waved Rufus over toward the door. "I need your help," he huffed. Rufus grinned. "Hurt to say that?" "Not as much as I thought," Eldridge answered as the two men left the courtroom. Chapter 52. Silas Howard stood on the rampart of the fort and stared through a glass at the town below. It cut the distance by a factor of 10, but added an element of blurriness to the edge of the image he found irritating. He lowered it in disgust. No matter how much he practiced the use, it still left him with an ache behind his eye. The object of his scrutiny was the main thoroughfare, and the small roads that cut across it just beyond. There were witnesses there. Nothing that could be proved, of course, just the ravings of a small child and the woman who chose to believe her over the word of a man like himself. A man of honor. A decorated soldier. A gentleman. Still he was troubled. The woman was married to one of the deputy marshals, and if she chose to press the issue, that man might cause problems. Even the judge was pestering for an inquiry. He did not seem the least bit satisfied by the report delivered by Silas' own men, a report that laid the blame for the massacre squarely where it belonged. On the Indians. Savages as bad as the Mormon scourge itself. He shook his head and spat over the side of the wooden palisade in disgust. "Private," he shouted and waited for the pounding bootsteps of the man who stood below to ascend the ladder and stand at attention behind him. "Sir? There is an issue I need addressed in town." He turned and squinted. Private Scott Kilgore was a reprobate and known criminal. His record told Silas the man was faced with a choice. Army on the western frontier or prison. He had many men like him in his unit, but he was not bothered by their sordid pasts. "I'm your man," Kilgore answered through tobacco-stained teeth. His particular past was what interested Silas the most. "I read you have a problem with women?" Kilgore shifted and gulped. "No problem, sir." Sweat beaded his dusty brow and dripped into busy eyebrows. "And if I ordered you to have a problem?" The lined face broke into a leering grin. "I'm supposed to follow orders," said Kilgore. Silas spoke for a few moments more and sent him on his way. He watched as three men departed the gate, Kilgore and two others. They were not great soldiers, nor, he imagined, particularly good criminals since they found themselves here under his command. But he trusted they would do as asked and get the job done. Chapter 53. "You have a nice day," Ned said as she departed through the door. He couldn't help but notice the way she looked up and down the street, as nervous as a cat. She smiled as she left and lifted her small basket of sundries affixed to her arm. He didn't see the man who called out to her. She looked in one direction and a second man approached from behind. He knocked her basket loose from her arm and laughed as everything she had just purchased fell out onto the boardwalk and ground. Ned scurried around the counter and began to help her pick it up. "Leave her," the man who first caught her attention said from a slanted shadow next to the building. "What kind of manners did your mama teach you?" The soldier who knocked the basket from her arm kicked Ned in the ribs and sent him sprawling off the height of the boardwalk. The storekeeper landed with a thud on the earth and groaned. Sarah gave a small squeal of terror and tried to hop down to help Ned. Kilgore grabbed her by the arm and yanked her up. "I think I need tending more than he does," he leered. She lashed out and clapped him across the jaw with her hand. He held her wrists in his fist and licked away a trickle of blood from a split lip. "That hurt," he growled and backhanded her. Sarah fell with a cry. The door behind them cracked open. "Marshal!" Will screamed, eyes wide in terror. He dashed between the soldiers, dodged their grips as they lunged for him. Will hit the dusty street at a full sprint and made the distance to the marshal's office before they could recover. "Let's go," one of the men said to Kilgore. "I'm not done here," he replied. The other two soldiers bolted for their horses. He saw they were not going to stay to back him, and he fled as well. Pete followed Will out of the jailhouse and held him back as three mounted soldiers galloped past on their way to the fort at the top of the hill. Will led him across the street to where Ned lay in agony, while Sarah tended him. "What happened?" Pete kneeled next to Sarah. "Ribs, busted," Ned gasped. Sarah glanced up at him, red cheek growing purple. Pete put a gentle finger under her chin and lifted her face to better see the damage in the light. "Did they do this?" She nodded. "Go get the doc," he ordered Will. The boy raced off to retrieve the resident medicine man. "Stay with him," Pete told her. "Don't," Sarah gripped his hand. "You heard Eldridge," Pete said through gritted teeth. "We don't allow women to be hit in this town." He marched across the street, boot heels kicking up small puffs of dust. Pete mounted his horse and wheeled it after the departed soldiers. "He's going to need help," Ned said. Sarah nodded and wondered who she could get. Chapter 54. She stood in front of the canvas tent and wondered where to knock. The option was taken away from her when a small boy flipped back the flap and watched her with ebon eyes. "Is your mother here?" Sarah said and dabbed at the tears in her eyes with a soiled handkerchief. Alma moved the boy back into the tent, and stared at Sarah with a questioning look. "Did your man hit you?" she asked. Sarah shook her head. "He went after the man who did." "Good. Soldiers," she sobbed. Alma nodded. "Stay," she said to the boy behind her and closed the tent flap. "Come," she dragged Sarah with her. Alma settled the woman onto the wagon buckboard and laced the horses into the harness. "Hurry," Sarah said through tears. Alma didn't change her pace because it needed to be done right, or it might hurt the mounts or damage the wagon. It was still fast though, and within a few moments, she was behind the reins and aimed for their destination. They passed Pete's horse racing back toward the jail on the way there. "You need to be strong," Alma said as they rode to the fort. The gates were closed. Pete's body lay just to the side of the road. Sarah made to jump from the wagon, but Alma grabbed her by the arm and made her wait. She climbed down and examined the man where he lay. "Alive," she said. Sarah jumped down and bit back a gasp at the sight of her young husband. His face was a motley collection of blood and bruises, nose smashed sideways, lips and eyes swollen and misshapen. "Help," Alma said. Soldiers manned the ramparts and began catcalling the two women as they struggled to load Pete into the back of the wagon. He moaned as they settled him on the bare planks. Sarah cradled his head and Alma took up the reins. She turned the wagon around and drove Pete to the doctor's place. Chapter 55. "I've got two things on my mind," Rufus said. "And a bath is one of them." "I hear you," Eldridge agreed. Their sojourn of discovery across the river had yielded little. Rufus' network of contacts had only seen the aftermath of the massacre, and though they could share that it was not an Indian attack, they could not say who had done the deed. It was disappointing, and promised to be more so when they delivered the news to the judge. "I'll tell him," Eldridge volunteered. "You didn't see me stepping up," Rufus grinned. They rode through town as the edge of the afternoon sun began a fast run toward sunset. Eldridge turned toward Miss Laurie's house with a nod while Rufus continued toward his own home in the direction of the river. He tied up out front, but before he could pull back the flap on the tent, Alma stepped outside and put her hands on his chest. Rufus grew angry as she told him what the soldiers had done, and by the time she was finished, he was back on his horse, despite her protests. She watched him ride in the direction of the fort and wondered what she should do. He reined in at the gate of the fort. "You have a son of a bitch in there," he called to the lone guard at the top of the rampart. "You bring him on out here to face up to what he's done. You ain't getting nothing out of here, you coon bastard." The guard jeered. Rufus wheeled his mount back and forth in front of the gate. The man wasn't wrong and it grieved him. The fort was designed to repel Indian attacks, and though it was made of wood, it might as well have been made from stone. The thick pine boles were more than enough protection from a lone rider like himself. He wondered for a moment if he should cross the river and gather up a war party to assist him. After all, it was why the soldiers were here, to pacify the Indians and protect the border to the territory. He might as well give the soldiers an action for their reason. He discarded the thought as he glared at the guard. A war party would be declaring war, and the repercussions for an already downtrodden people would be too high a price to pay for his anger. He thought of Pete and his hand itched to draw his weapon and send a shot through one of the eyes that watched him. But that was Eldridge's way, and he had counseled against it often enough that the irony of the desire was not lost on him. By that time, a third and fourth soldier appeared, drawn by the noise at the gate. They watched in silence as Rufus hauled up in front of the gate again. "Somebody is going to have to answer for what you done," he shouted. "Get out of here," Kilgore shouted back as he gripped the palisades with his gnarled hands. "That boy knew what he had coming, and if I come down there, we ain't going to stop at just a beating for you." Rufus almost drew. He grabbed his rope instead, played out a loop and swung it over to one side of his head. "He thinks he's a cowboy," the first guard taunted. Rufus let go of the lasso and sent the rope sailing up toward the gate. It rolled around the neck and arm of Kilgore, who gaped in confused amazement. Rufus twirled a knot around his saddle horn and spun his mount to race back toward town. The taut rope hauled Kilgore up and over the edge of the rough-hewn pine logs. He landed with a thud in the dirt, and screamed as Rufus dragged him back to town. The deputy marshal stopped in front of the jail and hauled the rope the rest of the way in. Kilgore tottered on battered legs as Rufus led him inside and locked him in a cell. He stepped out on the porch and watched a group of 12 soldiers boil out of the fort on horseback. Rufus went in and closed the door. He moved the desk in front of it. "You made a big mistake," Kilgore slurred. "They're gonna burn this jail down with you in it." Rufus loaded a Henry rifle with several rounds, and began work on a shotgun, lining up shells on the desktop within short reach. "You're in here with me," he said as he concentrated on his task. That shut Kilgore up. It took the soldiers 5 minutes to reach the jail. They wheeled their horses back and forth in front of it, yelling, cursing, and when one shot into the doorway, the rest took up the invitation and peppered the wall with bullets. Rufus hunkered down behind the desk as splinters showered around him. Kilgore lay on the floor under the bunk, curled up in a ball, screaming. The fusillade stopped as the men reloaded. Rufus popped up in the window, took aim and sent a shotgun blast into the crowd of horsed soldiers. One man gave a yell and slipped to the side of his mount. It reared and knocked him askew, dragging him back up the street as it galloped for the fort. They renewed their shooting, the cacophony of rifles shattering the purple twilight of dusk. Oily clouds of blue smoke coated the street. Eldridge stomped around the corner, 2 pistols in hands. His shirt was untucked, one leg of his breeches in a boot, the other flapping loose, like a man dressed in a hurry. His sharp eyes picked out the soldiers in front of the jail and he marched toward them, pistols at the ready. The first man pitched forward from his mount, preceded only by the front of his skull. Another stood straight up in his saddle, gripped his shattered shoulder and slipped off his mount. He was joined by a third he folded in half to drop between the legs of the horses. The riderless mounts shied at the smell of blood so close and began a stampede to their home stable. The other soldiers noted their fallen comrades and realized they were under attack from the rear. They wheeled about and began to return fire at the man walking up the street, shooting them. Rufus took advantage of the lull and knocked his Henry in the window. He shot a Solider in the arm, a second in the thigh. The 2 men were too much. The angry mob of soldiers turned and raced up the street to get away from them. Eldridge stood in the middle of the roadway and sent 3 shots after them until they were too far out of range. He glared at the fallen bodies in front of the jail. 2 of the men squirmed in agony, blood leaking into the dirt. The third lay in a puddle of his own head. Rufus opened the door and peeked out, rifle at the ready. An easy relieved grin broke out on his face when he spied Eldridge further up the road. "Should have known it was you," he said as he bent to toss away the pistol and examine one of the wounded men. "Wondered who you had pissed off enough to shoot up my jail." Eldridge stood over the fallen. "Get on out of the way and let me clean up this mess." "I think we'll use the dock instead," said Rufus. "Give the judge a chance to decide what to do with these 2 and their buddy I got in there. That what all the fuss is about." Eldridge sniffed. He holstered one pistol, but kept the other out and ready in case the soldiers came back. "They beat Pete," Rufus explained. "Beat him pretty bad." Eldridge grunted. "Sure you don't want me just to solve it right here?" Rufus shrugged. "Could help if you got the doc." "You're the one that wants to patch him up so bad," Eldridge said. Rufus stood, torn between wanting to get the medicine man to help the men and afraid to leave them under the marshal's not-so-gentle ministrations. "Go on," Eldridge snickered. "I won't shoot them if you don't want me to." Rufus nodded. "Thank you," he said. "I think it's up to the judge." "Just wasting rope, if you ask me," Eldridge grumbled. But he slid his pistol back into the leather as a sign of good faith. Rufus nodded again and hurried to gather the doctor. Chapter 56. The dawn broke with the sound of reveille echoing across the town even before the roosters began to crow. The gates of Fort Smith cracked open and spilled out a long orderly platoon of soldiers led by Commander Silas Howard. They rode in unison toward town and down the middle of the street. Shelley stepped out of his saloon to watch the procession as it stopped in front of the small courthouse. The line was long enough that it put a dozen men in front of the jail. The door was shut again, and Rufus peered through the window at the soldiers as they stared straight ahead at the back of the man in front of them. Ned limped out of the door to his store and watched, along with other citizens awakened by the noise and bustle. Judge Parker turned the corner from his home and took his time walking up the street. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, nor even aware of the men commanding the roadway. But he was, and it bothered him. What scared him the most was the chance for violence on the street, a high likelihood if Eldridge was involved, and he had no doubt the marshal was about. He spied the door to the jail closed, the riddled walls silent and the oily glint of a rifle in the window. Parker stopped in front of Commander Howard and swallowed the rise of fear that threatened to choke him. If the shooting started, standing right in front of the soldiers wasn't a good place to be. "Commander," Parker nodded. "Good morning. You have several of my men in custody." "3," Parker agreed. "The fourth lies dead with the Undertaker. I wish to assure you the actions of those men were taken without my knowledge." "That is good to know. But I insist they be treated under military law, and therefore fall under my jurisdiction." Parker glanced up and down the line of men behind the commander. "You seem intent on enforcing that law." "I did not wish to display the might I have at my disposal, nor wish to bring it against the interests of the town," said Silas. "Yet you did," Parker answered. "I did. These men of yours attacked an officer of the law. As I understand it, he was not in the commission of his duty," said Howard. "The report I was given stated it was a personal matter regarding a woman." He sneered down at Parker. "His wife," Parker corrected. "His wife is a woman." "She is," the judge agreed. "A woman of my acquaintance who I have had the pleasure of dining with on multiple occasions." "Seems like he might have a problem with you then," Silas mocked. Parker raised his eyebrows. "A woman of reputation beyond reproach," he answered. "I think Marshal Sample discussed women with you recently." Silas flushed. A crimson stain crept up his neck and brightened his cheeks. Parker's smile made it worse. "Yes, I see you do recall that lesson. I would hate to see it repeated." "Those are my men," Silas grunted. "Men acting outside of your orders?" "As I said. Men who were out of the fort without your leave engaged in a criminal act. I am aware of what they did, Parker. I will handle it in a military fashion." Parker shook his head. "I don't think you will have these men today." His words sent a ripple down the ranks. The nervous tension spread to the horses who shifted and nickered in line. "Do you think you have enough men to stop me?" "Enough?" Parker peered at the line again. "Rufus? Any man draws and he's the first to go down." The rifle barrel in the window adjusted. Parker squinted up at Silas. "And lest we forget, the Marshal is out there and he might not even let your men draw." "Every man behind me is ready to die in service," Silas answered. But he didn't seem sure as the men fidgeted in their saddles. "These men are under my law. They broke the law." The two men stared at each other. Silas was the first to break, eyes dropping to the gloved hands clenching his saddle horn. "Thank you for the impressive display of your military prowess," Parker said. "Your parade this morning reminds me of my many days in the war." Silas grumbled and grunted. He turned to the sergeant next to him and ordered 6 men to remain with him while the rest returned to the fort. Parker watched the unit do an about-face and clop back up the hill. Silas and his small group of men cantered over to the saloon and tied up to the post. Shelley ushered them through with one arm while he waved at the judge with the other. Chapter 57. "You look like a man who needs a drink," Shelley rasped. He led the seething Garrison commander to the bar and slapped the scarred wood. "Charlie, set them up." The other soldiers gathered at a table and eyed the 2 whores Shelley had on display next to the hallway and back. Charlie poured out 2 shots. "Leave the bottle," Shelley said and waved the bartender away. "I want to see it." Silas slammed his drink. "I want him shot dead in the street like a mangy cur." "That's a tall order, General," Shelley said. "I'm not a general." "Not yet, you're not." The saloon keeper sloshed out 2 more dollops. "Can you do it?" Shelley took his time with his drink, glancing around the room to see who had overheard. There were only the soldiers, the whores and the drunk in the corner sleeping off last night's celebration. "There's not much I can't do," he admitted. "The question you need to be asking yourself is will I?" Silas guzzled his shot and slammed the empty glass onto the bar. "He made a fool of me," he muttered. "I will not be made a fool of." "You might be better served running discipline on those soldiers of yours that you still got," said Shelley. "They made a fool of you too." Silas snorted and reached for the bottle. Shelley moved it away from him for a second, then poured another 2 drinks. "They were acting on orders to prevent knowledge of an act you are well aware of from becoming too well known." "I'm a simple man, Commander," Shelley said. "Don't talk in circles." "They were keeping the girl quiet. The one who knows about the massacre." Again Shelley glanced around. No one else in the room seemed to be paying attention to them, but that didn't mean the commander should go about blabbing their business. The cavalry soldiers were fixated on the whores, who were doing their best to keep that attention with loose open shirts and wide open legs hinting at what lay in the shadows. The drunk was in his own state, and confirmed it with a snuffled snore. "Get him the hell out of here," Shelley pointed to Charlie then turned back to the commander. "A fact I can appreciate," he said in a lower voice. "But reason still stands. You go pissing in the direction of that judge and his dog comes off the leash. Kill them," Silas slurred. "Kill 'em both." Shelley held his glass to his lips. "Don't think I haven't tried," he said below his breath. "I can pay," Silas said. He seemed to take notice of his surroundings and double-checked to see that no one watched them. Satisfied, he reached into his tunic and withdrew a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the bar with a clink. Shelley drizzled another shot for the man, then checked inside the pouch. The glint of gold winked back at him. 25 pieces, said Silas. 500 to get it done. Shelley cinched the pouch closed. And 500 more once the deed is done. Silas blared at him with bleary eyes. Drinks on the house, he held up his glass. I always buy for my friends, Shelley toasted him back. One of the girls in the chair next to the hallway stood up and sauntered back to her room. She shut the door behind her and shimmied through the window to the alley outside. Chapter 58. Eldridge opened the door to the general store and scanned for Will. His eyes settled on the boy. "Coffee," he ordered. "Yes sir," Will jumped and skedaddled. The marshal picked a bench up from in front of the store and carried it across the street. He set it against a clapboard wall in the shade. "Marshal?" Ned stuck his head out of the door of the store. "What are you doing with my bench?" "Sitting." Eldridge settled on the bench with his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out across the plank walkway. Ellie opened up the cafe and let Will out with a tin pot of coffee and a metal mug. The boy passed the cup to the marshal and poured the dark liquid in with shaking hands. "Morning, Eldridge," Ellie said as she watched. "Morning, Ellie. We're open." She wiped her hands on an apron. "You don't have to sit out here. It's a fine morning, Ellie. I think I'll have my coffee here." She stared up and down the empty dust-covered street and shrugged. "Eggs?" "Just the coffee for now, thank you, Ellie." She glanced at the street again before she ducked back into her cafe. "Don't break my window." "I'll try not to break anything," he answered. "But I can't make any promises." Chapter 59. Commander Silas mounted up and led two soldiers from the open gate to the road into town. His bearing was straight, shoulders thrown back with a haughty air. He couldn't keep a smile from his face. He had received word last night to attend the saloon this morning, that business pre-arranged would manage to be resolved today. He knew what it meant, and let the grin hurt his cheeks. They reined up in front of the saloon and tied their horses off to one side. He moved his men to the wall past the door and leaned against it, looking more out of place in his attempted nonchalance than if he meant to be there. People were used to soldiers on the street, but after the shootout and standoff the day before, the presence of blue uniforms was unnerving and people fled to interior climbs behind the safety of wooden walls. Judge Parker walked around the corner to his home and checked for wagons, horses and coaches in both directions before crossing the road. He noted the soldiers against the wall and adjusted his path from the boardwalk to the street to have an excuse to put distance between them. "Good morning," he called in a polite monotone. Two men leapt from the dark interior of the saloon, slammed the swinging doors open. "Eat, lead and die, Parker," screamed the first one. Two shots rang out and both men fell in front of the commander and his soldiers. Eldridge stepped out of the shadow of the cafe, revolver in one hand, coffee mug in the other. He walked across the street, gun trained on the soldiers in front of the saloon. "Looks like these miscreants were lying in wait, Judge." Parker stared at the dead men bleeding out on the ground. The suddenness of their attack and subsequent rendering of their brain upon the dirt had taken him by surprise. "Marshal," he said in thanks. "Seems like the kind of ambush set up by an army man." Eldridge aimed his Colt at the commander. Silas held up both hands to show they were empty. "My weapon remains holstered," he glared at Parker. "Marshal," the judge warned. "Those two next to you ain't holstered." Eldridge cocked the hammer back on his pistol, cracking the morning silence. "Eldridge," said Parker. "We can't shoot men down in the street." "I can and will," said the marshal. He noted with satisfaction the beads of nervous sweat dotting the foreheads of the three men in front of him. His eyes never remained still. They roamed over the men, over their faces and hands, over the wall and window on either side of them. Another ambush could come through the door, and he would be ready. Or an assassin from the window. "They're not going to stop, Judge," he explained. "This is a problem that ain't going away. We'll return to the fort," Silas pleaded, hands still raised. "Till when?" "Till you're ready to make another run at the man. Better to end this now. Let's go to the courthouse, Eldridge." "I'll be along directly, Judge." "Marshal," said Parker. "I'm coming." He turned to accompany the judge. "You're dead," Silas screamed. He fumbled with his pistol, clumsy with the left hand, as the soldiers accompanying him raised their rifles to shoot the two men in the back. Eldridge spun around and drilled 3 shots into the men. They slammed into the wall, and fell on top of the dead men on the boardwalk. Eldridge walked up to the bodies and put 3 more shots into each of them. Parker watched him in resignation. "Marshal," he sighed. "What have you done?" Eldridge stepped through the swinging doors, gun still out. "You have to be careful with your gun out like that, Marshal," Shelley said from a table in the corner. "A man might think you meant to do harm in his place of business." Eldridge stomped up to the bar and laid his pistol across the scarred wood top. "You've got a mess to clean up out front, Shelley," he motioned Charlie to pour him a drink. "I expect that's the last mess I'm going to see from in here." Shelley walked across the room to join him. Charlie set up 2 glasses and poured them. Eldridge set down his coffee cup and lifted the tumbler full of bourbon. His right hand stayed on the bar top close to his gun. "One day, Marshal," Shelley threatened as he toasted the man. Eldridge sipped the man's whiskey down in 2 gulps. It was the good stuff, Shelley's private stock, and he was glad for the taste of it. "But not today," he answered and walked out. Chapter 60. Eldridge stepped over the 3 dead men in the dirt and walked to the telegraph office. The train depot was constructed, the telegraph hut attached to the ticket window, though the tracks were still just out of town. The St. Louis-San Francisco linemen were running telegraph wires even as they built the railroad, taking advantage of the clearing of land. The marshal rapped on the window to attract the attention of the man sleeping on a cot inside. "Get ready to send a message," he instructed the operator. The man waved for a moment to prepare himself, then gathered a pad and pencil to take the message. "Dear President Grant, you need a new colonel here." "That it?" "I believe it is all for now." The marshal carried his coffee mug back to Ellie's. He believed he would have those eggs now. Chapter 61. "Gentlemen," Parker sat on the edge of his desk in the courtroom and looked upon each of the 3 men in front of him. Long lean Marshal Eldridge Sample leaned against the wall, like a coiled spring, his ever-present flask at hand. Rufus Black stood next to him, almost a man at attention, his dark eyes attentive on the judge. Pete was beside him, the swelling and bruising from his face finally gone down to an acceptable level, the purple and blacks faded to yellow and blue. "We have a great task before us, but it is a monumental effort of our own making." "He's gonna give us more work," Eldridge said. "Seems like all we're doing isn't cleaning up as much as making room for the next crop of miscreants." Parker sighed. "Marshal, you have struck upon the timeless dilemma of law and order. What makes a man turn to criminal activity? And what will redeem him?" Eldridge patted his long-barreled Colt with the bottom of his flask with a tink-tink-tink ring. "Redemption provided," he said. Parker shook his head in amusement. When President Grant had assigned the marshal to his service, he had known the man only by his reputation from the war. He was finding that the reputation was mild in comparison to the actuality of the man. "We need to grow," he told them. "I plan to hire 6 more marshals in as many weeks and go about the task of solving the problem our criminal vacuum has created. You think you can find 6 more young dumb sons of bitches to go out there with us?" "I'm not so young anymore," Rufus shared a grin that lit up his face. "Who you calling dumb?" Pete lisped through slightly swollen lips. "Judge, think you can get me a couple of single men who ain't always belly-aching to go home to their wives this time?" "And young men complain a lot less about sleeping on the ground," Rufus observed. Parker watched the trio play at friendly bickering. They were good men, he thought. No, he corrected. They were great men at being bad. The kind of men it would take to clean up the town and prepare it for the next evolution the railway would bring. Civilization had its own set of problems unique to city life. Criminals always seemed to find a way to thrive, no matter the environment though. These were the men who would make ready the world to come after. He was proud to be one of them. "My fear is you've created a bigger problem," he told Eldridge. Eldridge reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a square bottle to dribble amber liquid into 4 glasses. He gave the one in front of him an extra dollop. "Easiest way to solve a problem, Judge." He took a sip. "Is head on. The end."